I am Stanley, 69 years old, and I spent my entire life building things meant to last. I was holding a solid brass pen hovering over the signature line of a $3.6 billion federal energy grant. It was the culmination of 15 years of my life. Suddenly, the pen was yanked directly out of my hand. I looked up. My 32-year-old CEO, Griffin, stood over me with a smug grin. He announced to the room of 18 federal investors that I was being terminated effectively immediately. My own son, Cameron, the vice president of the company, was sitting right next to Griffin. Cameron did not defend me. He just stared at the mahogany floor. Before I tell you how a simple piece of plastic around my neck cost them an empire, let me know what city you are watching from in the comments. Please like and subscribe if you believe that loyalty should never be a one-way street. The boardroom was dead silent. The air conditioning hummed above us. 18 men and women in tailored suits stared at Griffin in absolute shock. I slowly lowered my empty hand to the table. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of anger. I just looked at the young man who thought he had outsmarted a veteran engineer. I remained perfectly calm. I smoothed out the cuff of my jacket. Griffin folded his arms, waiting for me to beg. I refused to give him that satisfaction. Griffin leaned across the massive conference table and pointed at my chest. He demanded that I hand over my security badge and leave the premises instantly. He spoke to me as if I were a common criminal caught stealing office supplies. He proudly declared that the company was moving in a younger and more dynamic direction. He claimed my engineering methods were outdated. I unclipped the plastic badge from my lapel. I placed it gently on top of the heavy stack of contract documents. The lanyard made a soft tapping sound against the wood. I stood up from my leather chair. I looked at Cameron again, hoping my son would finally find his courage. Cameron just shifted in his seat and refused to meet my eyes. He had sold me out for a corner office. What Griffin and Cameron completely failed to understand was a fundamental rule of federal government contracts. They were blinded by their own greed and corporate jargon. The United States Department of Energy does not award Tier 1 security clearances to corporations. They award them to individuals. It took me 7 years of intense background checks, polygraphs, and classified project evaluations to earn that specific clearance. I was the only person in the entire organization legally authorized to access the core data servers for the green energy grid. The company did not own the clearance. I owned the clearance. Griffin thought he was simply firing an old man to save money on a high salary. He had no idea he was actually severing the only bridge between his company and the federal government. I buttoned my suit jacket. I did not bother trying to explain this to him. When an arrogant man is making a fatal mistake, it is always best to let him finish. I pushed my chair in perfectly straight. I gave Griffin a polite nod. I told him I wished him the best of luck with the new direction of his dynamic company. Griffin sneered and told me the security guards would escort me to the parking garage. He turned his attention back to the investors, putting on his most charming corporate smile. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and spread his hands out in a welcoming gesture. He truly believed the hard work was over and the billions were already in his bank account. He was so foolish. The lead federal investor was a stern woman named Director Harper. She had been observing the entire spectacle with cold and calculated eyes. She did not return Griffin's charming smile. Instead, she reached out and picked up my discarded security badge. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she stood up. Director Harper calmly closed her leather briefcase. The metallic snap echoed loudly in the tense room. She informed Griffin that the $3.6 billion grant was predicated entirely on my personal engineering oversight. She stated clearly that without my active security clearance, the company was no longer in compliance with federal law. Therefore, the grant was instantly voided. Griffin froze. His smug smile vanished, replaced by a look of sheer terror. He started stammering, waving his hands and promising that Cameron was fully capable of taking over the project. He pointed to my son, desperately trying to sell him as the new chief engineer. Director Harper did not even look at Cameron. She signaled to the rest of her team. All 17 other investors stood up in complete unison. They began packing their bags and gathering their coats. Griffin rushed around the table, begging them to sit back down. He pleaded for a temporary extension. He offered them increased equity and lower profit margins. He was sweating through his expensive suit. The investors completely ignored him. They marched toward the double doors in a single file line. Director Harper paused at the threshold. She turned back to Griffin and delivered the final blow. She told him that his company would be heavily audited for this sudden change in leadership and potential breach of contract. She dropped my badge onto a side table and walked out. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind them. In less than 2 minutes, Griffin had successfully destroyed the biggest financial deal in the history of the industry. The room felt entirely empty. The air was thick with the suffocating realization of total failure. I watched Griffin collapse into the nearest chair, pulling at his hair. I felt no pity for him. I turned my back on the pathetic scene. I walked toward the exit with my head held high. I knew my worth, and I knew they would soon realize exactly what they had just lost. I pushed the doors open. I walked down the long glass hallway toward the elevators. The afternoon sun was streaming through the massive windows, casting long shadows across the carpet. I did not look back at the boardroom. I pressed the elevator button and waited for the doors to open. My mind was already calculating my next steps. I needed to secure my pension documents and contact my financial advisor. Suddenly, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled the device out and looked at the bright screen. It was a text message from Cameron. After sitting in absolute silence while his boss publicly humiliated and fired me, my son finally decided to communicate. I opened the message expecting a weak apology or a cowardly explanation. Instead, the words on the screen made my blood run entirely cold. The text read perfectly clearly, "Father, do not come home." Megan just changed the locks. Megan was my white daughter-in-law. She had always looked at me with thinly veiled disgust, but I never expected this level of vicious cruelty. They had not just taken my career, they had coordinated a massive strike against my personal life while I was distracted at the office. The elevator doors chimed and slid open. I stepped slowly inside the empty metal box. I pressed the lobby button. The real war had just begun. My silence would be their undoing. I drove through the heavy afternoon traffic with a singular focus. The sky above had turned a bruised purple and a cold rain began to hit the windshield of my old sedan. My mind was still processing the sheer audacity of my son's text message. I pulled into the quiet, tree-lined suburban street where I had lived for 3 decades. The familiar sight of my 2-story colonial home usually brought me a deep sense of peace. Today it brought a sharp sting of betrayal. I parked in the driveway and turned off the engine. The rain was falling steadily now. I stepped out of the car and looked up at the wide wooden porch. There, stacked haphazardly against the front door, were 6 large cardboard boxes. The rain was already soaking through the cheap cardboard, ruining whatever was inside. I walked up the concrete steps, my heart pounding a heavy rhythm against my ribs. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my brass house key. It was the same key I had used every single day since my wife Cynthia and I bought the place. I slid the metal into the deadbolt and turned it. The lock did not yield. It was completely jammed. I pulled the key out and inspected it. It was fine. I pushed it back into the mechanism and applied more pressure. Nothing happened. The lock had been replaced entirely. I was standing in the freezing rain, locked out of my own life. The heavy oak door suddenly swung inward. Megan stood in the doorway, perfectly dry and wearing an expensive cashmere sweater. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, and she held a steaming mug of tea in both hands. She looked down at me standing in the pouring rain. A slow, cruel smile spread across her perfectly made-up face. She did not look like a woman who had just usurped her father-in-law's home. She looked like a conqueror admiring her new territory. She took a delicate sip of her tea before she finally spoke. She told me I was trespassing on private property. I stared at her, feeling a cold wave of realization wash over me. I asked her what she thought she was doing. She did not answer directly. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her tailored trousers and pulled out a neatly folded piece of heavy legal paper. She tossed it onto the top of the nearest wet cardboard box. It landed with a soft slap. She told me I needed to read my mail more carefully. I looked down at the document. The bold black letters across the top read, "Notice of foreclosure and seizure." My chest tightened. This house was not just a piece of real estate. 30 years ago, my late wife Cynthia worked double shifts as a pediatric nurse just to afford the down payment. We had agreed from the start that the house would be bought entirely with her hard-earned savings, a permanent sanctuary for our family. When Cynthia passed away from cancer 5 years ago, this house became the only tangible piece of her I had left. Every scratch on the hardwood floor, every painted wall, and every planted rosebush in the backyard held her memory. Megan knew exactly what this place meant to me. She knew the history and she knew the sentimental value. Yet she stood there sipping her tea, watching the rain destroy the boxes containing my clothes and Cynthia's framed photographs. She crossed her arms and leaned against the doorframe. She told me the bank officially took possession of the property at noon today. She smiled again and added that she and Cameron had simply purchased it back from the bank at a steep discount during a closed auction. I was suddenly a homeless man standing on the porch of a stranger. I reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the wet document. The rain blurred some of the ink, but the legal jargon was unmistakable. I had spent decades reading complex federal engineering contracts, so deciphering a standard banking foreclosure notice was effortless. I scanned the lines of text, rapidly searching for the point of failure. I owned this house outright. I had paid off the final installment of the mortgage 2 years after Cynthia died. There was absolutely no logical reason for a bank to seize the property unless a massive debt had been secured against it. My eyes landed on the second page of the addendum. The truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. Exactly 6 months ago, a commercial equity loan had been taken out using the house as collateral. The loan was for $2.5 million. I traced the routing information printed at the bottom of the page. The funds had not been deposited into any of my personal accounts. The money had been transferred directly into the primary operating account of Griffin's corporate startup. They had leveraged my entire life to keep their sinking company afloat while they waited for the federal grant to be approved. They had gambled my wife's legacy on a business they could not even manage properly. But a loan of that magnitude required the explicit notarized consent of the property owner. It required my physical presence, my identification, and my signature. I flipped to the final page of the document where the guarantor signatures were located. The rain was coming down harder now, soaking my shoulders and running down my neck. I wiped a drop of water off the paper to see clearly. There at the bottom of the page was my name, Stanley. It was signed in blue ink. It was an exact replica of the signature I used on official documents. But I had never seen this paper before in my life. I had never stepped foot in that specific bank branch. I had never authorized a single penny to be borrowed against Cynthia's home. I stared at the blue ink. Someone had orchestrated a massive financial fraud using my identity to steal my property and fund their own corporate ambitions. I looked closer at the signature. It was nearly perfect, but 40 years of drafting engineering schematics trains the eye to notice structural anomalies. The loop on the letter S was slightly too tight. The pressure applied to the final letter Y was heavy and jagged. I knew that specific handwriting flaw. I had spent countless hours at the kitchen table teaching my son how to write in cursive when he was 7 years old. Cameron always gripped the pen too tightly on the downward strokes. My own son had forged my signature. He had committed federal bank fraud to steal his deceased mother's home, all to impress a 32-year-old CEO. Megan watched me reading the paper. She laughed softly, a sharp metallic sound. She told me I had 10 minutes to get my trash off her porch before she called the police to report a trespasser. She stepped back inside and slammed the heavy oak door shut. The lock clicked loudly into place. I stood alone in the storm. I did not scream. I carefully folded the forged document and placed it into my dry inside coat pocket. I picked up the small, soaked box containing Cynthia's photos. I turned my back on the house and walked slowly toward my car. They wanted a war. I was going to give them one. I drove away from the neighborhood I had called home for 30 years. The heater in my old sedan struggled against the damp chill, but the cold I felt was entirely internal. I navigated the slick, rain-washed streets until I reached the industrial outskirts of the city. I pulled into the flickering neon glow of a roadside motel. The asphalt lot was cracked and empty. I paid the night clerk with the emergency cash I always kept in my glove compartment. The room smelled of stale smoke and heavy industrial bleach, a stark contrast to the lavender scent Cynthia always kept in our hallways. I sat heavily on the edge of the stiff mattress. A sharp beep broke the silence of the room. It was the medical monitor strapped to my wrist. My heart rate was elevating into the danger zone, a physical reaction to the sheer stress of the afternoon. I reached over and silenced the alarm without a second thought. I did not have the luxury of resting or worrying about my blood pressure tonight. I placed the small rain-damaged cardboard box on the cheap laminated nightstand. Then I set my worn leather briefcase on the faded bedspread. I snapped the brass latches open. The familiar smell of aged leather and old paper grounded me. My enemies thought they had stripped me of all my resources when they took my office and my house. They were severely mistaken. I reached inside the dark compartment. Before I could begin my counteroffensive, I needed to ensure my physical stamina would hold out. The tight pressure in my chest was a constant reminder of my advanced age and my medical reality. I pulled my laptop from the briefcase and connected to the unsecured motel internet network. I navigated to my digital pharmacy portal to order an emergency refill of my beta blockers. The medication was expensive but absolutely necessary to keep my heart rhythm stable during high-stress situations. I entered the prescription details and proceeded to the payment screen. I typed in the numbers for my primary checking account. The screen loaded for a few seconds before flashing a stark red error message indicating the transaction was denied. I frowned, assuming it was a simple fraud alert triggered by the motel network. I pulled out my secondary credit card, a platinum account with a massive limit I had maintained for 2 decades. I entered the numbers carefully. The screen flashed denied again. A cold realization began to form in my mind. I quickly logged directly into my primary banking portal. The screen loaded, but instead of showing my balances, a massive legal banner blocked the page. It stated that all assets and accounts under my name had been frozen pending a judicial review. I read the fine print at the bottom of the notification. The freeze was enacted under an emergency guardianship petition. The petitioner was Cameron. My own son had filed legal documents with a local judge claiming I was suffering from severe rapid-onset dementia and was entirely incapable of managing my own finances. He had used my sudden termination as proof of my supposed mental decline. Cameron and Megan had not just stolen my house. They had legally financially paralyzed me. They wanted me destitute, sick, and completely unable to hire a lawyer to fight back. They expected me to panic. They expected the lack of medication to weaken me into submission. They thought taking my money meant taking my power. They vastly underestimated the kind of engineer I was. I closed the banking tab. I did not waste another second feeling sorry for myself. I pushed the laptop aside. I stopped trying to solve the problem with money. Money was a tool, but information was a weapon. I ran my fingers along the interior fabric of my leather briefcase. When I bought this case 20 years ago, I specifically chose a model with a reinforced hidden bottom panel. I pressed my thumb hard against the lower right corner. The false bottom popped loose with a soft click. I slid my hand into the narrow cavity and pulled out a sleek matte black solid-state drive. It was no larger than a deck of cards, but it held the power to bring Griffin's entire corporate structure to its knees. During my 15 years developing the core architecture for the federal green energy grid, I understood the massive security risks involved. The government demanded absolute perfection, but corporate executives like Griffin only cared about profit margins and rushed deadlines. 5 years ago, I realized that if the company ever fell into the wrong hands, the nation's energy infrastructure could be severely compromised. So I built a safeguard. I coded a deeply buried, fully encrypted administrative backdoor into the primary server architecture. It was an override that existed completely outside the company's network protocols. It bypassed their firewalls, their passwords, and their IT department. Only my specific security clearance credentials and the encryption keys stored on this very drive could access it. Griffin thought he owned the system because his name was on the building lease. He did not realize that I was the ghost in the machine. I plugged the drive into my laptop. A black terminal window instantly appeared on the screen, demanding a 72-character alphanumeric password. I typed it in flawlessly from memory. The screen turned bright green, displaying the master control node for Griffin's entire data network. Every single piece of intellectual property, every client file, and the entire federal project framework was sitting right at my fingertips. I watched the data streams cascading down the monitor, reflecting in my glasses. Griffin had built his arrogant facade on the assumption that he controlled this information. He paraded around the boardroom, treating me like a disposable asset, completely ignorant of the invisible threads holding his empire together. Now he was about to learn a very painful lesson about the architecture of power. I did not need to destroy the data. Deleting federal property would make me a criminal, and I had no intention of breaking the law. I simply needed to change the locks exactly like Megan had done to my home. I brought my hands to the keyboard. I typed a single precise line of command code. It was a complete revocation protocol. It instantly invalidated every security certificate and user access token associated with Griffin's corporate domain. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the persistent ache in my chest. Then I pressed the enter key. The terminal window flashed once and disappeared. It was done. It was entirely silent, but the digital shockwave was massive. At this exact second, every employee logged into Griffin's network was abruptly kicked offline. Every server connection was severed. The company was now completely locked out of its own product. Tomorrow morning, Griffin would walk into his sleek office, expecting to salvage the federal deal and parade around as a brilliant CEO. Instead, he would find himself staring at blank screens. His empire would go completely dark. I shut the laptop and finally lay back against the stiff motel pillows. Let them panic. They had started this war by taking my badge and my home, but they had left me with the one thing that truly mattered: my mind. Tomorrow they would beg for mercy. The thin curtains of the motel room did little to block the harsh morning sunlight. I was already awake, sitting in the single stiff armchair watching the dust motes dance in the air. I knew exactly what was happening across the city. Griffin and his executive team were currently staring at black screens completely locked out of their own infrastructure. The silence in my room was shattered by 3 violent pounds on the flimsy wooden door. The sound echoed off the cheap paneled walls. I did not rush. I stood up slowly, feeling the stiffness in my knees, and walked to the door. I unhooked the chain and pulled it open. A young man in a cheap gray suit stood on the concrete walkway. He did not look like motel staff. He held a thick, heavy stack of manila folders secured with thick rubber bands. He looked down at a clipboard, then up at my face. He asked if I was Stanley. I gave a single slow nod. He shoved the heavy stack of folders directly against my chest. I had to bring my arms up quickly to catch the massive weight of the paper. The young man took a step back, snapped a quick photo of me with his phone, and loudly declared that I had been officially served. He turned on his heel and sprinted back to his car. I closed the door and locked it. I walked back to the bed and dropped the heavy folders onto the mattress. The legal assault had arrived. I snapped the rubber bands and opened the first folder. The sheer volume of paper was designed to intimidate, a classic corporate litigation tactic meant to crush an opponent before they could even read the charges. I put on my reading glasses and scanned the bold text on the primary injunction. The plaintiffs were listed as Griffin's corporate entity, and shockingly, Megan was listed as a co-plaintiff acting as a financial stakeholder. They were not just suing me for breach of contract. They had filed a civil lawsuit for $50 million in damages. The charges listed on the second page were severe. They were formally accusing me of corporate sabotage, intellectual property theft, and domestic cyber terrorism. They painted a picture of a disgruntled, mentally unstable former employee who had maliciously destroyed their central servers in a fit of rage after a lawful termination. They were demanding immediate financial restitution, knowing full well my accounts were frozen. But the money was only a distraction. The final paragraph of the document requested the immediate involvement of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Griffin and Megan did not just want to bankrupt me. They wanted to see me handcuffed, prosecuted, and locked in a federal penitentiary for the rest of my natural life. They were trying to criminalize my defensive maneuver to force me to surrender the master access keys. If convicted of federal cyber terrorism, I would face up to 30 years in a maximum security facility. It was a brutal, calculated strike designed to trigger absolute panic. A normal man would have collapsed under the weight of a $50 million lawsuit. A normal man would have grabbed the phone and begged for a settlement. I simply turned to the next page. I had spent 40 years dealing with federal regulators and cutthroat defense contractors. I knew that the thicker the legal document, the more lies it contained to hide its structural weaknesses. Griffin was terrified, and this massive stack of paper was his desperate scream for help. I pulled the second folder from the stack and spread the technical filings across the faded bedspread. If Griffin was going to accuse me of intellectual property theft, he had to prove he actually owned the property in the first place. I ignored the aggressive legal threats and focused entirely on the data. I read through the sworn affidavits signed by Griffin and his newly promoted vice president, my son Cameron. They detailed the exact timeline of the server crash and included a comprehensive list of the allegedly stolen data files. I flipped to the financial exhibits attached at the very back of the injunction. These were the documents submitted to the judge to prove my actions had caused immediate catastrophic financial harm, thereby justifying the asset freeze and the emergency lawsuit. I dragged my finger down the columns of numbers. My engineering background demanded mathematical precision, and I immediately spotted the glaring inconsistencies. The financial records they submitted under oath were completely fabricated. They had drastically inflated the company's operational revenue to make the supposed losses look catastrophic. More importantly, they had hidden the $2.5 million loan they illegally took out against my home. They presented the company as highly profitable right up until the exact moment I cut the server access. They had committed perjury by submitting doctored financial ledgers to a federal judge. This was a catastrophic mistake on their part. In their desperate rush to crush me, they had weaponized a lie. If I could expose the altered numbers, the entire $50 million lawsuit would collapse and they would be the ones facing federal charges for defrauding the court. I took out a pen and began circling the fabricated data points. I was building a map of their deceit line by line. I reached the final document in the pile. It was a mandatory summons. I was ordered to appear at a formal legal deposition the very next morning at the offices of Griffin's high-powered corporate attorneys. I stared at the bold font dictating the time and location. Then the true strategy behind this massive legal assault clicked into place. Griffin did not actually want to go to trial. A trial would expose his doctored financials and his utter lack of federal security clearance. He needed the servers turned back on immediately, or his entire company would implode within 72 hours. The lawsuit was nothing but a giant club meant to beat me into submission. They were summoning me to a hostile deposition to lock me in a room with a dozen lawyers. Their goal was to terrify me into signing a settlement agreement that legally transferred the master administrative access directly to Cameron. They needed my physical signature on a specific release form to bypass the federal fail-safes I had built. They thought I would show up broken, exhausted, and willing to sign anything to avoid prison. I carefully folded the summons and placed it into my breast pocket. I was going to attend their deposition. I was going to walk right into their trap. I arrived at the towering glass skyscraper that housed Griffin's legal team precisely at 9 in the morning. I was directed to a massive, sterile conference room on the 50th floor. I took my seat on one side of a long mahogany table. I was entirely alone. Directly across from me sat a veritable army of hostility. Griffin was slouched in a plush leather chair wearing a bespoke Italian suit. Megan sat next to him, her eyes gleaming with predatory excitement. Cameron was seated at the far end, looking everywhere except at me. Flanking them were 5 high-priced corporate lawyers, their briefcases open and their laptops glowing. The lead attorney, a slick man with a sharp jawline, looked at me with open contempt. He made a snide remark about my attire, loudly pointing out that a man facing a $50 million lawsuit should probably wear something better than a faded corduroy jacket and scuffed loafers bought a decade ago. Griffin laughed loudly at the insult. Megan joined in, whispering something into Griffin's ear that made him smile even wider. They wanted me to feel small. They wanted the sheer wealth and power in the room to break my spirit before the legal proceedings even began. I did not react to their childish insults. I simply folded my hands on the table and waited for the court reporter to set up her stenography machine. The real game was about to start. The court reporter asked everyone in the room to raise their right hands and swear to tell the truth. I did so with complete calm. The lead attorney immediately launched his aggressive assault. He did not ask questions to gather facts. He fired rapid accusations meant to batter me into submission. He demanded I confess to maliciously locking the corporate servers. He demanded I hand over the master administrative passwords right then and there to mitigate the massive financial damage I had supposedly caused. He threatened me with imminent federal prison time, pacing back and forth across the room to emphasize his sheer power. I remained completely silent. My silence seemed to infuriate Griffin, who slammed his fist on the mahogany table and demanded I answer his expensive lawyer. When raw intimidation failed, they switched to their most cruel and calculated tactic. The lead attorney called Cameron to speak for the official record. My son cleared his throat nervously. He looked at his hands and began to recite a clearly rehearsed script. Under penalty of perjury, Cameron testified that I had been displaying severe signs of paranoia and rapid cognitive decline for the past year. He claimed I had become obsessively territorial over the federal grant, entirely delusional about my own importance to the overarching project. He stated for the official record that I had illegally copied sensitive corporate data to a private encrypted drive before deliberately crashing the network in a fit of dementia-induced rage. Listening to my own flesh and blood assassinate my character under oath was a profound kind of pain. He was willing to have me declared legally insane and thrown in a federal cage just to save his own corporate title. Megan watched my face closely, desperately hoping to see a tear or a break in my stoic composure. I gave her absolutely nothing. I let Cameron finish his pathetic tapestry of lies. The lawyer then asked Cameron if he genuinely believed I was a direct threat to the financial stability and the intellectual property of the corporation. Cameron finally looked up, his eyes cold and entirely empty. He said yes. The lawyers smiled triumphantly, deeply confident that they had built an airtight case for emergency guardianship and criminal prosecution. They had painted a beautiful masterpiece of deceit. It was finally time for me to burn it down. I leaned forward slightly in my chair. The movement was small, but it immediately drew the attention of everyone in the sprawling room. I looked directly past the line of aggressive lawyers and locked eyes with Griffin. I spoke for the very first time since entering the building. My voice was steady, resonant, and completely devoid of the fear they expected to hear. I told the lead attorney that I had a single clarifying question for the chief executive officer before I responded to any of their ridiculous demands. The lawyer scoffed loudly, stating I was in no position to interrogate anyone. But Griffin held up his hand to silence his counsel. His massive arrogance was his greatest weakness, and he simply could not resist the opportunity to flex his authority over me on the official legal record. He leaned back in his plush leather chair, crossed his legs, and smugly told me to ask my question. I addressed the court reporter first, ensuring she was actively recording every single syllable I was about to say. Then I looked back at Griffin's arrogant face. I asked him to state clearly and unambiguously under oath that his corporation was the sole legal owner of the core architectural design for the green energy grid. I asked him to confirm that this specific design was the proprietary intellectual property of his private company created within his facilities and entirely under his exclusive corporate control. Griffin laughed out loud. He looked down the table at his lawyers, who were all nodding in smug agreement. Griffin leaned forward into the recording microphone positioned in the center of the mahogany table. He stated proudly that his company absolutely owned every single line of code, every complex schematic, and every mathematical algorithm associated with the entire project. He claimed total ownership and total operational control. He even added a mocking remark, stating that my outdated brain might have physically typed the code, but his company legally owned the computer I typed it on. He felt incredibly powerful in that specific moment. He had just claimed absolute dominion over the most advanced energy grid design in the entire country. He had also just walked blindly into a devastating federal trap I had set 15 years ago. I asked him to confirm his definitive statement one final time for absolute legal clarity. Griffin sneered, looked directly into my eyes, and loudly said yes. I reached into the inner pocket of my faded corduroy jacket. I bypassed the forged foreclosure document and pulled out a single neatly folded sheet of heavy ivory paper. It was not a corporate contract. It bore the heavy embossed seal of the United States Department of Defense. I slid the document across the smooth table directly to the court reporter. I instructed her to enter it into the official record as Exhibit A. The lead attorney frowned and snatched the paper before the reporter could take it. He read the first few lines, and the blood instantly drained from his face. His arrogant posture collapsed. The document was a classified federal patent. It proved conclusively that the core architectural design did not belong to Griffin's company. It was classified national security property developed under a strict military grant I had secured years before Griffin was even hired. By claiming absolute ownership and control of classified defense technology under oath, Griffin had just provided a recorded confession to felony corporate espionage and theft of government property. The lawyers froze in sheer terror. Griffin demanded to know what the paper was. I stood up slowly from my chair. I looked down at the men who thought they could bury me. I told Griffin he was no longer suing an old man. He had just declared war on the federal government. The fallout from the deposition was instantaneous. I did not even have to make a phone call to alert the authorities. The court reporter's encrypted digital transcript was automatically flagged by the Department of Defense liaison assigned to monitor the energy grant. Within 2 short hours of Griffin uttering his arrogant confession, the gleaming glass doors of his corporate headquarters were violently shattered. A massive tactical team of Federal Bureau of Investigation agents swarmed the pristine marble lobby. They did not politely ask for the receptionist or wait for an appointment. They poured out of black tactical vehicles wearing heavy tactical armor and carrying sweeping federal warrants. They stormed the executive suites on the 50th floor with terrifying speed. I sat securely in my car parked across the street, watching the magnificent chaos unfold through my rain-slicked windshield. The federal agents began hauling out heavy stacks of hard drives, sealed server racks, and endless cardboard boxes of paper files. Every single computer monitor in the building was violently unplugged and tagged as federal evidence. The young, arrogant executives who had openly laughed at my faded corduroy jacket earlier that morning were now standing on the wet sidewalk in the pouring rain, holding small personal boxes, looking completely terrified. The entire corporate facade was effectively dismantled in less than 30 minutes. They were treating the luxury building like an active crime scene because that is exactly what it had become. Griffin had triggered a massive national security protocol. Through the heavy glass walls of the ground floor lobby, I saw Griffin being physically pushed against a marble pillar by two senior federal agents. He was no longer the smug visionary who had boldly fired me in front of 18 investors. He was sweating profusely, his expensive, bespoke Italian suit wrinkled and stained with spilled coffee. The federal agents loudly demanded the administrative encryption keys to the classified servers. Griffin was panicking like a trapped animal, frantically pointing his shaking finger at the man standing trembling beside him. He pointed directly at my son Cameron. I watched my own flesh and blood recoil in absolute horror as his wealthy boss betrayed him without a single second of hesitation. Griffin was screaming to the stern agents that he was merely the financial executive of the corporation. He loudly claimed he had absolutely zero technical knowledge of the secure systems or the classified military patents. He swore under federal scrutiny that the vice president of engineering was entirely and solely responsible for all the classified data transfers. To prove his desperate lie, Griffin forcefully pulled a thick stack of heavily redacted authorization forms from his leather briefcase and shoved them directly into the lead agent's hands. I knew exactly what those specific forms were. When Cameron had conspired with Griffin to take my job, he had eagerly signed hundreds of technical transfer documents without ever bothering to read the fine print. He was too desperate to solidify his new powerful corporate title. By signing those papers, Cameron had legally accepted full documented responsibility for moving classified military data onto unsecured commercial servers. The lead FBI agent carefully reviewed the blue ink signatures, looked up at Cameron, and immediately ordered him to place his hands behind his back. The heavy metal handcuffs clicked loudly, a definitive sound I could practically feel vibrating in my own chest from across the street. My son was being arrested for federal espionage, corporate sabotage, and gross mishandling of critical national security assets. The mandatory minimum sentence for those specific federal charges was 20 long years in a maximum security penitentiary. Cameron collapsed to his knees right there in the lobby, weeping hysterically, begging Griffin to tell the agents the truth. Griffin just looked away, already calculating his own expensive legal defense strategy. He had used my son to steal my company, and now he was using him as a human shield. I did not intervene. I sat perfectly still and watched them load my crying son into the back of a dark, heavily armored federal transport vehicle. I started the engine of my old sedan and drove away from the shattered glass and the flashing red and blue police lights. I navigated back to my cheap motel room, locked the flimsy door behind me, and sat heavily on the stiff mattress. 10 minutes later, my cell phone began to vibrate violently against the laminated nightstand. The caller identification displayed a restricted number originating from the local federal holding facility. I slowly accepted the call and pressed the phone to my ear. Cameron's voice immediately came through the tiny speaker, choked with heavy, breathless sobs and sheer, unadulterated panic. He was breathing erratically, desperately begging me to just listen to him for 1 minute. He cried out that the federal agents were currently processing him for high treason and corporate espionage. He pleaded with me to call the Department of Defense to use my old military contacts to explain that it was all a terrible misunderstanding orchestrated entirely by Griffin. He sobbed loudly, reminding me that he was my only child, my own flesh and blood. He promised to give me the house back immediately, to restore my frozen bank accounts, to do absolutely anything I wanted if I would just save him from spending the next 2 decades in a concrete cell. He sounded exactly like the terrified 7-year-old boy who used to hide behind my legs during loud thunderstorms. But he was not an innocent boy anymore. He was a grown man who had actively forged my signature to steal his dead mother's beloved home. He was a man who had sat in a formal deposition just hours ago and sworn under penalty of perjury that I was mentally insane, all to protect his own greed. I listened to his frantic pleading until he finally ran out of breath and was just gasping into the receiver. The silence on the line was incredibly heavy. I did not raise my voice or show any anger. I spoke with absolute freezing clarity. I told him that my son died the exact moment he sold his mother's legacy to a corporate thief. I told him I have no son. I pressed the red button and ended the call. The phone did not stay silent for long. Less than 2 minutes after I hung up on Cameron, the device rang again. This time it was a private local number. I answered it cautiously. Megan's voice hissed through the small speaker. She was not crying for her arrested husband. She was absolutely furious, her tone sharp, calculating, and full of pure venom. She had already heard about the federal raid and Cameron's incarceration, but instead of apologizing or begging for mercy, she doubled down on her profound cruelty. She coldly informed me that she had anticipated a potential legal counterattack and had meticulously prepared a contingency plan to destroy me. She claimed to have fabricated a massive, incredibly detailed file of medical and financial documents. These fake documents detailed an illicit, decades-long affair and massive financial embezzlement committed by my late wife, Cynthia. Megan threatened to release the entire destructive file to every major media outlet in the city, permanently destroying Cynthia's pristine reputation in our community and dragging her sacred memory through the mud. She issued a strict, non-negotiable ultimatum. I was to contact the federal prosecutors immediately, completely retract my statement regarding the classified patent, and publicly claim the entire deposition was a mistake caused by my declining mental health. She hung up the phone before I could say a single word in response. I stared at the dark screen, realizing the depths of her true depravity. I did not reply to her vicious threat over the phone. I refused to give her the satisfaction of hearing my voice waver. Instead, I sent her a single text message instructing her to meet me at the central branch of our regional bank in exactly 1 hour. The drive downtown was absolutely agonizing. A sharp, squeezing pain radiated across my chest and traveled slowly down my left arm. My heart was violently struggling to maintain its regular rhythm without the daily beta blockers Cameron had deliberately prevented me from purchasing. I parked my old sedan in the wet lot and walked heavily through the massive polished brass doors of the bank building. The grand lobby was relatively quiet, filled with the low hum of hushed conversations and the clicking of automated counting machines. Megan was already there. She was sitting elegantly on a tufted velvet waiting bench near the large front windows. She looked completely unbothered by the stark reality that her husband was currently sitting in a federal holding cell, facing decades in prison. I approached her slowly, my breathing shallow and visibly labored. I demanded she hand over the small white pharmacy bag resting casually on her lap. I knew she had intercepted my emergency prescription delivery at my house earlier that morning. Megan picked up the bag and dangled it from her perfectly manicured fingers. She smiled warmly, watching the cold sweat form on my forehead. She knew exactly how much physical pain I was enduring. She told me the medication was mine to take, but it came with a very steep price. She was holding my physical life hostage right in the middle of a crowded public lobby. Megan patted the empty space on the velvet bench right next to her, gesturing for me to sit down like an obedient dog. I absolutely refused. I stood tall over her, forcing myself to completely ignore the tightening vice gripping my heart muscle. She sighed dramatically, pulled a freshly printed legal document from her expensive designer handbag, and laid it flat on the glass coffee table between us. It was a formal affidavit of retraction drafted by expensive lawyers. It stated clearly that my previous sworn testimony regarding the classified military patent was entirely false, brought on by severe cognitive decline and intense emotional stress. She tapped a heavy gold pen against the signature line. She told me to sign the paper right now, or she would throw my life-saving medication directly into the lobby trash can and walk out the front door. But the malicious blackmail did not stop there. Megan leaned forward, her voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial whisper. She informed me that while she was boxing up my personal belongings yesterday, she had thoroughly searched my private home office. She had intentionally broken the lock on my filing cabinet and discovered the official paperwork for a highly private financial trust. It was a secondary medical trust my late wife Cynthia had established many years ago, kept entirely separate from our primary joint accounts. Cynthia had quietly funded it with her own family inheritance, specifically designing the account to cover my future healthcare costs so I would never become a financial burden to anyone in my old age. Megan looked up at me with pure, unadulterated malice shining in her eyes. She proudly declared that since Cameron had successfully enacted the emergency financial guardianship order, she now possessed full legal authority over all my assets, including Cynthia's hidden medical trust. She told me the trust currently contained over $400,000 in liquid cash. She planned to drain every single penny of it before the bank closed today to pay the exorbitant retainers for Griffin's elite criminal defense attorneys. She was gleefully planning to use my dead wife's protective money to save the very man who had just destroyed my son. She smiled her chilling smile and pushed the gold pen closer to my hand. She told me I had exactly 1 minute to make a final choice between my physical heart and my dead wife's legacy. I looked down at the heavy gold pen resting on the glass table, then at the white prescription bag dangling loosely in her hand. The pain in my chest was nearly blinding now, a massive crushing weight pressing down hard on my lungs. A younger man might have panicked and lashed out physically. A weaker man would have grabbed the pen, signed the document, and surrendered absolutely everything just to make the terrifying physical pain stop. But Megan fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the man she was trying to break. I did not raise my voice to cause a scene. I did not beg for my medicine. I simply turned my back on her and walked deliberately toward the main teller counter. Megan scoffed loudly behind me, calling me a stubborn, suicidal old fool. I ignored her insult entirely. I bypassed the standard customer line and walked directly up to the elevated desk of the branch manager. His name was Mr. Harrison, and I had known him professionally for over 20 years. I leaned heavily against the polished mahogany wood of his desk to steady my trembling legs. Mr. Harrison looked up from his computer screen, immediately noticing my pale face and my labored breathing. He stood up quickly, asking in a panicked voice if he needed to call an ambulance for me. I raised my hand to stop him. I told him I did not need an ambulance. I told him I needed to execute a direct federal banking override. I took a slow, painful breath and recited the exact alphanumeric statute for the Federal Elder Financial Abuse Prevention Act. I instructed him to immediately invoke Section 314 of the Patriot Act regarding the suspicious financial exploitation of a vulnerable senior citizen. I informed him that the younger woman currently sitting in his lobby was attempting to unlawfully liquidate a protected medical trust using a fraudulent guardianship order based on perjury. Mr. Harrison's eyes widened in realization. As a senior bank official, he knew that this specific federal code required mandatory and immediate action from the institution without the need for a prior court order or a judge's signature. It was a massive nuclear option designed to instantly freeze assets the very moment a senior citizen reported financial coercion. I pulled my state identification card from my wallet and placed it firmly on his desk. I told him to lock the entire system right now. Mr. Harrison did not hesitate for a single second. He sat back down and immediately began typing rapidly on his secure administrative terminal. Because Megan had previously linked her own personal checking and credit accounts to our primary family portfolio to facilitate her initial theft of my house, her entire financial profile was now directly tied to mine inside the bank's mainframe. Within 10 seconds, Mr. Harrison activated the severe federal freeze protocol. A loud, sharp beep echoed from the computer terminal, officially confirming the administrative action. He looked up at me and nodded sharply. The override was completely successful. At that exact moment, Megan marched impatiently up behind me, completely oblivious to what had just occurred. She was holding her premium platinum credit card, loudly demanding that Mr. Harrison process a massive wire transfer to Griffin's legal team immediately. She slammed the plastic card onto the wooden counter. "Mr." Harrison calmly picked up the card and swiped it through his machine. The screen instantly flashed a bright warning red. He looked at Megan with absolute professional coldness. He informed her that the transaction was declined. He then stated loudly that under strict federal law, all of her personal and linked accounts were now permanently frozen, pending a full criminal investigation for elder financial abuse. Megan's smug expression vanished entirely. She stared at the red screen in absolute shock. I reached over, took my pharmacy bag from her limp hand, and walked away. Megan stood frozen in front of the bank manager's desk. Her mouth opened and closed, but absolutely no sound came out. The bright red screen of the terminal reflected in her wide eyes a glowing testament to her sudden ruin. Mr. Harrison calmly handed her platinum card back to her, holding it by the very edge as if it were physically contaminated. She snatched it from his fingers, her perfect corporate facade crumbling into raw, ugly panic. She demanded to speak to the regional director, immediately screaming that she was a wealthy stakeholder and this was a massive administrative mistake. Mr. Harrison did not argue. He simply signaled the armed security guards standing near the vault. He told her firmly that the federal freeze was absolute and advised her to retain independent legal counsel before she made her situation significantly worse. The guard placed a heavy hand on her shoulder, escorting her toward the polished brass doors. The entire lobby watched her humiliating exit in absolute silence. I walked out right behind her, clutching my white pharmacy bag. In the parking lot, she did not even look in my direction. She pulled out her phone and frantically called Griffin. Her voice echoed across the wet asphalt. She was screaming hysterically, cursing his name and accusing him of dragging her into a massive federal investigation. She told him their partnership was completely over and that she was keeping every single asset they had hidden in her personal name. The rats were finally trapped in the corner and they were beginning to viciously cannibalize each other to survive. I got into my old sedan, turned the key, and drove away from the bank. I returned to the dark, quiet sanctuary of my motel room and immediately took my beta blocker. My heart rate slowly returned to a steady, manageable rhythm as the medication flooded my system. I spent the next few hours sitting in the stiff armchair, outlining the structural weaknesses of Griffin's remaining corporate shell on a yellow legal pad. Just after midnight, a heavy, frantic pounding violently shook my cheap wooden door. I looked through the small glass peephole. It was Cameron. His expensive, bespoke suit was torn at the shoulder, his silk tie was missing, and his face was severely bruised, likely from a scuffle during his federal booking process. He had somehow managed to post an emergency cash bond using a shady bail bondsman before the authorities realized his assets were entirely tied to the frozen accounts. I unchained the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Cameron pushed his way inside, bringing the sharp smell of stale alcohol and raw fear into the small room. He was shaking violently from head to toe. He turned to face me, and the dim, flickering motel light caught the dull metallic gleam of a heavy steel revolver clutched tightly in his right hand. He was waving the barrel erratically, pointing it at the floor, then at the ceiling, then directly at his own chest. His eyes were completely bloodshot and wild with sheer panic. He backed himself into the far corner of the room and slid down the cheap patterned wallpaper until he hit the stained carpet. He sobbed uncontrollably, pressing the cold steel barrel of the gun against his own jawline. He cried out that his entire life was completely over and there was no way out. He had called Megan from the federal detention center, desperately begging for her help and her legal contacts. Instead of hiring him a lawyer, she had instantly filed for an emergency divorce. She formally and completely severed all legal ties to him to protect her own remaining interests from the government seizure. She had taken his car, drained his emergency savings, and abandoned him to face the massive federal espionage charges entirely alone. He gasped for air, his trembling finger resting dangerously heavy on the curved trigger. He told me he could not possibly survive 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He said he was going to end it all right here on the floor right now to spare himself the ultimate humiliation of a highly publicized criminal trial. He was a broken, pathetic shell of a man, utterly destroyed by the very people he had sold his soul to impress. He squeezed his eyes shut and tightened his grip on the heavy weapon. I did not panic. I did not raise my hands in the air or shout at him to put the dangerous weapon down. My heart rate remained completely steady, anchored by decades of extreme discipline. I had seen this exact look of blind, animalistic terror in the eyes of young men many times before. Long before I became a senior structural engineer and long before I built complex federal energy grids, I spent 3 brutal years crawling through the humid, blood-soaked jungles of Vietnam as a frontline combat medic. I had spent my youth patching up shattered soldiers who were screaming in absolute agony, desperate to die right there in the mud, rather than face the excruciating pain of survival. I knew exactly how to handle a man who had completely lost his grip on reality. I walked slowly and deliberately across the small motel room, keeping my movements smooth and predictable. Cameron opened his eyes and pointed the trembling barrel directly at the center of my chest, warning me in a cracked voice to stay back. I completely ignored the lethal threat. I closed the short distance between us in 3 long, rapid strides. Before his alcohol-addled and panicked brain could even process the sudden movement, I struck with absolute precision. I brought my left forearm down hard against his wrist, instantly redirecting the barrel of the revolver toward the floorboards. Simultaneously, my right hand clamped down fiercely over the cylinder of the weapon, physically preventing it from rotating and firing a bullet. With a sharp, practiced twist of my wrist, I ripped the heavy gun straight out of his weak grasp. Cameron cried out in sudden pain and curled into a tight, trembling ball on the carpet. I stepped back, holding the weapon securely in my steady hand. I pressed the cylinder release latch and snapped the gun open. I turned the steel frame upside down. 6 heavy brass bullets fell from the chambers. They hit the cheap wooden nightstand and bounced onto the carpet with loud, distinct thuds. I tossed the empty, useless steel frame onto the unmade bed behind me. I looked down at my son, who was now weeping pathetically into his hands, entirely defeated by his own cowardice. He had come here looking for a tragic and dramatic exit, but he lacked the actual courage to pull the trigger when it mattered. I knelt down so my face was exactly at his eye level. I grabbed him roughly by the lapels of his ruined suit and pulled him up until he was forced to look directly into my eyes. I told him he was not going to take the coward's way out and leave me to clean up his mess. I told him he was going to stand up like a man, face the catastrophic disaster he had actively created, and fix it. Cameron stared at me through his thick tears, his breath constantly hitching in his throat. He asked me in a pathetic whisper how he could possibly fix a federal espionage charge when he had already signed all the transfer documents. The FBI already had the physical evidence locked in their vault. I let go of his suit lapels and reached into the deep inner pocket of my corduroy jacket. I pulled out a small, flat black rectangle. It was a high-grade voice-activated digital recording device I had purchased earlier that afternoon. I pressed it firmly into the palm of his shaking hand and curled his fingers tightly around the smooth plastic casing. I told him that the federal prosecutors did not actually care about a foolish middle manager who signed technical papers blindly to get a promotion. They wanted the mastermind. They wanted the wealthy corporate executive who had orchestrated the massive theft and lied under oath to a judge. I told Cameron he had exactly one chance to avoid spending the next 2 decades wasting away in a concrete box. He had to go directly to Griffin's private downtown penthouse apartment tonight. He had to wear the active wire and get his former boss to openly admit to the entire conspiracy on the digital record. He had to make Griffin confess that the forced signatures, the stolen house, and the illegal server breach were all his calculated ideas from the very beginning. I stood back up, towering over him, and pointed rigidly at the motel door. I ordered my son to get up, wipe his face, and do his job. I sat in my old sedan parked safely 3 blocks away from Griffin's luxury downtown penthouse. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still slick and black, reflecting the harsh yellow streetlights. The small earpiece rested securely in my right ear, connected directly to the digital frequency of the recording device I had just handed to my son. The audio feed crackled softly before picking up the heavy, rhythmic sound of Cameron's footsteps echoing down a marble hallway. I heard the electronic chirp of a keypad, followed by the heavy click of a deadbolt. Cameron pushed the door open. Instantly, the aggressive mechanical grinding of a heavy-duty industrial paper shredder flooded my earpiece. Griffin was not sleeping. He was frantically destroying evidence in the middle of the night. Cameron walked cautiously into the sprawling living space. Through the audio feed, I could hear Griffin cursing loudly as he jammed thick stacks of financial ledgers into the whirring machine. The penthouse, usually a pristine monument to his massive ego, was in total chaos. Cardboard boxes were ripped open and scattered across the expensive Persian rugs. Empty liquor bottles littered the glass coffee table. Griffin finally noticed Cameron standing in the doorway. He abruptly stopped feeding the shredder and spun around. His voice was sharp and laced with paranoid aggression as he demanded to know exactly how Cameron had bonded out of federal custody so quickly. Cameron's voice trembled slightly as he replied, making up a quick lie about a sympathetic bail bondsman. The tension in the room was suffocating, and the recording was completely clear. Griffin did not buy the lie for a single second. He was a cornered animal, and his survival instincts were currently operating on extreme high alert. He walked slowly toward Cameron, stepping recklessly over the piles of shredded paper. Through the earpiece, I could hear the heavy thud of Griffin's expensive leather shoes on the hardwood floor, growing louder and more menacing. My heart hammered a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs as I waited for the inevitable confrontation. He stopped just a few inches away from my son. Griffin's voice dropped to a cold, calculating whisper. He pointed out that Cameron was sweating profusely despite the penthouse air conditioning running at full blast. He noted the violent tremor in Cameron's hands and the erratic darting of his eyes. Griffin possessed a criminal mind, and a criminal mind is always expecting a trap. He suddenly grabbed Cameron by the shoulder, demanding to know if the federal agents had sent him back to gather more evidence in exchange for a plea deal. Cameron stammered desperately, trying to deny the terrifying accusation, but his voice cracked pitifully. Griffin's paranoia instantly escalated into violent action. He shoved Cameron hard against the living room wall. The impact echoed loudly through my earpiece, making me grip the steering wheel of my car until my knuckles turned white. Griffin ordered Cameron to empty every single pocket of his ruined suit and turn them completely inside out. The recording device was incredibly small, but I had taped it directly to the center of Cameron's chest, right beneath the thin fabric of his white dress shirt. If Griffin demanded he remove the jacket or unbutton the shirt, the device would be instantly exposed and Cameron would be trapped in a locked penthouse with a desperate man willing to do absolutely anything to avoid federal prison. I listened intently as Cameron frantically pulled out his empty wallet and his car keys, tossing them onto the glass table. Griffin was still not satisfied. He reached out and grabbed the lapels of Cameron's jacket, preparing to rip it open to inspect his chest. The entire operation was mere seconds away from a catastrophic failure. Cameron needed to do exactly what I had trained him to do back in the motel room. He needed to rapidly weaponize his own sheer terror. Just as Griffin's fingers dug violently into the fabric of the shirt, Cameron collapsed. He dropped heavily to his knees, clutching his chest with both hands, pressing down directly over the hidden wire to conceal it. He began to hyperventilate loudly, drawing in ragged, shallow breaths that sounded entirely genuine to anyone listening. He rocked back and forth on the floor, weeping and screaming that his chest was exploding perfectly, simulating a massive, debilitating panic attack. The sudden, pathetic display immediately disgusted Griffin. He let go of the jacket and stepped back in pure revulsion, wiping his hands on his trousers as if touching Cameron had physically contaminated him. He kicked Cameron sharply in the ribs, telling him to get up and stop acting like a pathetic child. Cameron remained on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. He looked up at Griffin and used the opening to execute the final verbal maneuver. He asked Griffin why he had done this to him. He asked why Megan had immediately filed for divorce the second the federal agents arrived at the holding facility. Griffin stared down at his broken vice president and let out a harsh, cruel laugh. His massive ego simply could not resist the opportunity to gloat over his entirely defeated subordinate. Griffin sneered and told Cameron he was the most gullible fool in the entire corporate world. Every single syllable was captured with crystal-clear audio quality by the hidden microphone taped to Cameron's skin. He proudly confessed that he had been sleeping with Megan in this very penthouse for over 2 years. He detailed exactly how they had laughed together in bed while planning the ultimate destruction of my career. Griffin openly admitted that the forged foreclosure documents were entirely his idea, specifically designed to strip me of my wealth so I could not afford to fight the illegal server transfer. He bragged loudly about manipulating Cameron into signing the classified data transfers, intentionally setting him up as the perfect legal fall guy, while he and Megan planned to take the federal grant money and flee the country. Griffin was shouting, now utterly intoxicated by his own perceived brilliance. He clearly stated his own name, my name, and the exact nature of the crimes he had committed. He handed me the absolute truth. I sat in the darkness of my car, listening to the echoing silence that followed Griffin's arrogant and damning confession. I reached down and pressed the red button on the receiver console, permanently saving the encrypted audio file to a secure cloud server. I did not need to hear another word. The trap had snapped shut with bone-crushing force. I pulled the small earpiece out and tossed it onto the passenger seat. I turned the ignition key. The engine of my old sedan roared to life, cutting through the quiet night air. I shifted into gear and pulled away from the curb. I did not drive toward the federal building to hand over the tape, and I certainly did not drive back to the cheap motel. The Federal Bureau of Investigation could easily handle the criminal espionage charges with the evidence they already had. But I needed something much more surgical to completely dismantle Griffin's remaining corporate assets and protect my own intellectual property. I merged onto the empty highway, heading toward the wealthiest financial district in the city. I was going to see a man who specialized in high-stakes corporate executions. I was driving straight to the private residence of Hayes, the most ruthless defense attorney in the state. The adjustment was entering its final phase. I parked my old sedan outside a fortress of modern architecture in the wealthiest district of the city. The massive steel gates swung open automatically, expecting my arrival. I had called ahead. I walked up the illuminated concrete steps and was greeted at the heavy glass door by Jonathan Hayes. Hayes was not a traditional lawyer. He was a corporate executioner. He built his incredibly lucrative career by dismantling corrupt executives and liquidating their stolen empires. He wore a perfectly tailored dark suit even at 2 a.m, his sharp eyes evaluating me with cold calculation. I followed him into his sprawling home office, a room lined with leather-bound legal texts and massive digital monitors. I did not waste his time with small talk or emotional appeals. I pulled the digital recording device from my jacket pocket and placed it squarely on his pristine glass desk. I told him I had a recorded confession of federal fraud, corporate espionage, and criminal conspiracy. Hayes raised a single gray eyebrow. He connected the device to his sophisticated sound system and pressed play. The pristine audio of Griffin violently shoving my son and arrogantly bragging about stealing my property filled the cavernous room. Hayes sat perfectly still, his hands steepled together, listening to every single syllable with the focused intensity of a predator studying its prey. When the recording finally ended, the silence in the office was absolute. Hayes leaned back in his leather chair and offered a terrifying, razor-thin smile. Hayes steepled his fingers and looked directly into my eyes. He told me the recording was a masterpiece of self-destruction. The criminal charges would easily land Griffin in a federal penitentiary for decades, but Hayes was not a prosecutor. He was a civil litigator, and he understood exactly what I was actually hiring him to do. I did not just want Griffin behind bars. I wanted to completely eradicate his financial existence and salt the earth where his corporate empire once stood. Hayes leaned forward and outlined the brutal reality of the legal war I was about to initiate. Launching a massive countersuit for malicious prosecution, emotional distress, and organized corporate fraud would require an immediate and staggering injection of liquid capital. Griffin still had access to hidden offshore accounts and would undoubtedly hire defense attorneys willing to employ every dirty stalling tactic in the book. Hayes looked at his computer monitor and pulled up my financial profile. He knew exactly how much money was sitting in Cynthia's protected medical trust. He told me his initial retainer would drain that account entirely, along with the heavily penalized early withdrawal of my remaining retirement pension. He was asking me to bet my absolute last dollar on his ability to utterly destroy my enemies. He placed a thick binding representation contract on the glass desk and set a heavy silver fountain pen right next to it. He warned me that if we lost this civil war, I would be entirely destitute, living on the street with a failing heart and absolutely zero safety net. I looked at the pen. I thought about the sheer arrogance in Griffin's voice on the tape and the utter cruelty of Megan trying to withhold my vital heart medication. I picked up the silver pen without a single ounce of hesitation. I pressed the nib to the thick paper and signed my name with absolute precision. I pushed the contract across the desk. I told Hayes I did not care about the money. The money was merely a tool, a necessary weapon to burn their parasitic kingdom to the ground. Hayes reviewed the signature, capped the pen, and nodded sharply. He told me to go back to my motel and get some sleep. The execution was scheduled for the morning. The emergency settlement meeting took place at 10 in the morning in the sterile conference room of Griffin's original legal team. The same 5 aggressive corporate lawyers who had gleefully mocked my cheap corduroy jacket just 24 hours ago were now sitting rigidly in their expensive chairs. They looked incredibly pale and sleep-deprived, desperately trying to contain the massive fallout from the disastrous federal raid. Griffin sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his face a tight mask of manufactured confidence. He still believed he could negotiate his way out of a federal espionage charge with a fat check and a non-disclosure agreement. I walked into the room entirely alone, taking my seat directly across from him. Griffin sneered, preparing to launch into another arrogant monologue about my lack of leverage. Before he could speak a single word, the heavy double doors swung violently open. Hayes strode into the room like a conquering general. He did not carry a briefcase or a stack of legal files. He carried only a small high-definition Bluetooth speaker. The lead attorney immediately stood up, his face flushing with anger, demanding to know who Hayes was and who gave him permission to interrupt a private settlement negotiation. Hayes completely ignored the man. He placed the black speaker right in the center of the mahogany table, directly in front of Griffin. Hayes formally introduced himself, and I watched the color instantly drain from the lead attorney's face. Every lawyer in the city knew exactly what it meant when Jonathan Hayes entered a room. Hayes pressed a button on his smartphone. The crystal-clear audio of Griffin's frantic late-night confession blasted through the speaker. The entire legal team listened in absolute horrified silence as their client openly bragged about sleeping with my daughter-in-law, forging federal banking documents, and deliberately framing my son for corporate espionage. Griffin lunged forward to smash the speaker, but Hayes casually pulled it completely out of his reach. The audio played continuously until Griffin's final arrogant declaration of guilt echoed off the glass walls. Hayes turned off the speaker and looked at the 5 trembling lawyers. He calmly informed them that by actively representing a man engaged in ongoing premeditated federal fraud, their own legal licenses and personal freedom were now in extreme jeopardy. The reaction was instantaneous. The lead attorney snapped his leather notebook shut with a loud and definitive crack. He stood up, completely ignoring Griffin, and addressed Hayes directly. He formally stated for the official record that his law firm was immediately withdrawing all legal representation for Griffin and his corporate entities, citing irreconcilable ethical conflicts and massive criminal exposure. The 5 lawyers practically sprinted out of the conference room, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive disaster sitting at the head of the table. Griffin was left entirely alone, completely abandoned by his expensive shield. I expected him to collapse to beg or to finally realize the sheer magnitude of his absolute defeat. Instead, Griffin leaned back in his chair and started laughing. It was a dark, grating sound that filled the empty room. He looked at Hayes, then locked his arrogant eyes on me. He clapped his hands together slowly in a mocking applause. He congratulated me on a brilliant tactical play, but proudly declared I was entirely too late. He leaned forward, his smile twisting into a vicious sneer. He revealed that while Cameron was frantically wearing a wire, he had been legally executing the final digital transfers. He had just successfully sold the company's remaining shell assets and vital hardware infrastructure to an anonymous foreign shell corporation. The money was already offshore. Griffin did not just move his stolen money offshore to protect himself. He actively launched a scorched earth public relations campaign designed to completely obliterate my personal credibility. If he could convince the world I was an unhinged malicious saboteur, my recorded evidence against him would be entirely dismissed as a vengeful fabrication. Less than 2 hours after the disastrous settlement meeting, every major national news network and financial blog simultaneously received a leaked anonymous audio file. It was presented as a frantic, hate-filled voicemail I had allegedly left on a private company server right after being publicly fired. I sat in my motel room and watched the breaking news alert flash across my television screen in bold red letters. The news anchor gave a solemn, disgusted warning about graphic language before playing the clip to millions of viewers. I heard my own voice fill the small room. The cadence, the deep timbre, and even the slight, familiar wheeze in my breathing were replicated with terrifying accuracy, but the words were absolutely not mine. The fabricated audio featured me screaming a barrage of vile racial slurs explicitly targeting Director Harper and the other federal investors. The fake recording seamlessly transitioned into a manic, hate-filled rant where I proudly confessed to destroying the company's servers out of pure, bigoted spite. Griffin had hired experts to generate a highly advanced artificial intelligence deepfake. He knew that in the modern corporate world, an accusation of severe prejudice was an instant death sentence. He was weaponizing my own voice to execute a highly public assassination of my character. The societal backlash was instantaneous and absolutely merciless. In the court of public opinion, the fake audio was all the proof the world needed to condemn me. Within 45 minutes of the initial broadcast, the secluded location of my cheap roadside motel was somehow leaked to the local press. I looked out the small, grimy window and saw a dozen news vans aggressively jumping the curb. Reporters holding heavy microphones and cameramen carrying bright shoulder lights swarmed the cracked asphalt parking lot like a pack of starving wolves. They banged violently on the thin wooden door of my room, shouting my name, demanding to know if I hated minorities and if my entire career was built on systemic bigotry. They shoved camera lenses directly against the glass pane, trying to capture a single image of the disgraced racist engineer hiding inside. I closed the thin curtains tightly and plunged the room into absolute darkness to avoid the flashing strobes. My cell phone began to ring endlessly. I answered a prioritized call from an encrypted Washington number. It was the senior legal liaison for the Department of Energy's investment block. The representative did not greet me. His voice was laced with pure, unmistakable disgust. He formally informed me that the federal government maintains a strict zero-tolerance policy regarding hate speech and racial discrimination. He stated that regardless of my technical brilliance or the classified patents I held, the investment board was permanently severing all current and future ties with me. I tried to speak to calmly explain that the audio was a meticulously crafted digital forgery designed by Griffin to discredit my testimony. The representative cut me off completely. He told me the federal tech analysts had already run a preliminary surface scan of the audio and found no obvious splice marks. As far as the government was concerned, I was a massive public relations liability they could no longer afford to touch. He hung up the phone completely, severing my access to the $3.6 billion grant. Griffin had successfully painted me into a corner where even my most powerful allies were forced to abandon me. I sat alone in the dark listening to the reporters screaming outside my door. I had lost my company, my son, my house, and now my entire professional legacy was reduced to a fabricated soundbite of pure hatred. I did not waste time feeling sorry for myself, and I absolutely refused to be destroyed by a sequence of manufactured binary code. I walked over to the small laminated nightstand, plugged in my heavy-duty headphones, and flipped open my heavy laptop. Griffin fundamentally misunderstood the man he was trying to frame. I was not a public relations executive who dealt in rumors, optics, and media spin. I was a senior structural systems engineer who had spent 40 years building invisible architecture out of raw data. To the untrained human ear, and even to a standard federal surface scan, the deepfake audio sounded flawless. But sound is not magic. Sound is pure mathematics. It is a precise series of physical vibrations moving through acoustic space, and artificial intelligence programs always leave microscopic mathematical footprints. I routed my internet connection through a secure proxy network to bypass the media swarm outside, and downloaded the raw audio file directly from the news broadcaster's open-source server. I dragged the file into my high-capacity engineering diagnostic software, a specialized program typically used to measure the microseismic acoustic frequencies of nuclear reactor turbines. I expanded the audio waveform across my entire screen, blowing up the digital soundscape until every single spoken syllable was represented by thousands of jagged green lines. I began the grueling, meticulous process of isolating the frequency wavelengths. Human vocal cords naturally produce microscopic organic anomalies. When a real person speaks, their breath interacts unpredictably with the physical shape of their throat, creating tiny, irregular acoustic spikes in the audio data. An artificial intelligence model, no matter how incredibly advanced, generates sound through predictive mathematical algorithms. It creates a synthetic voice that is entirely too perfect. I ran a deep spectral analysis on the specific vowel sounds hidden within the recording. Right there, buried deep within the subharmonic frequencies of the fabricated racial slurs, I found the anomaly. The breathing patterns did not match the physical exertion of the screaming voice. The acoustic reflections lacked the natural bounce of a physical room. The software flagged a repeating, perfectly symmetrical mathematical loop buried beneath the background noise. It was a synthetic compression artifact, a distinct digital signature left behind by the specific neural network used to render the fake voice. I had found the artificial fingerprint. I did not just identify the forgery. I actively traced its exact digital origin. The synthetic artifact contained a microscopic encrypted metadata tag. This was a standard commercial failsafe hard-coded into voice cloning software to prevent illegal deepfakes from completely escaping detection. I ran a highly aggressive brute force decryption protocol against the metadata tag, utilizing the massive processing power of my hidden solid-state drive. The code cracked in under 3 minutes. The decrypted data spilled across my terminal, revealing the exact commercial software license used to render the audio. It also revealed the precise time and location of the digital rendering. The software automatically logged the originating Internet Protocol address of the user who clicked the final export button. I cross-referenced the string of numbers with the local Internet Service Provider registry. The result was absolute, undeniable proof. The IP address did not belong to my mobile network, and it did not belong to the corporate office. It matched the exact residential fiber optic router installed in Griffin's luxury downtown penthouse. He had generated the fake audio file from his own living room couch. I saved the forensic diagnostic report and exported the entire tracing sequence onto a secure flash drive. Griffin thought he could use technology to completely erase my credibility. He forgot that I was the one who built the system. The next morning, Griffin decided to capitalize on his manufactured public relations victory. He orchestrated a massive, live-streamed press conference directly from the grand lobby of his corporate headquarters. I sat in my quiet motel room watching the broadcast on my laptop screen. The camera panned across a sea of hungry journalists and flashing bulbs. Griffin stood behind a sleek glass podium, looking impeccably groomed and entirely sorrowful. He had even hired a team of crisis management experts who stood stoically behind him to complete the illusion of corporate stability. Griffin leaned into the microphone and delivered a masterful performance of fake empathy. He told the world how deeply heartbroken he was to discover the toxic, bigoted views held by his former chief engineer. He claimed he had fired me not for financial gain, but to protect the integrity and inclusive values of his beloved company. He painted himself as a brave, progressive visionary who was now suffering the malicious cyber attacks of a disgruntled, racist former employee. Thousands of people were watching the live feed across multiple online platforms. The comments section rolling alongside the video was a relentless river of pure hatred directed entirely at me. Griffin smiled, a sad, practiced smile for the cameras, soaking in the universal sympathy of the public. He was absolutely convinced he had won the war. He did not realize his entire performance was being broadcast over the exact same internal network I had built from the ground up. Griffin had spent millions on public relations, but he had fundamentally ignored his own digital infrastructure. When I enacted the complete server lockout to protect the classified military patents, I had deliberately left one single microscopic backdoor open within the internal presentation network. It was a standard administrative override I originally designed to push emergency weather alerts to the massive digital screens scattered throughout the corporate building. Griffin and his expensive IT consultants were so focused on trying to break back into the heavily encrypted mainframes that they completely ignored the low-level audiovisual network. I opened a new terminal window on my laptop. The flashing cursor waited for my command. I inserted the secure flash drive containing the complete forensic diagnostic report of the deepfake audio file. I typed the sequence of administrative override codes with rapid, practiced precision. My fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the superficial firewalls his team had hastily erected. The internal security was laughably weak. In less than 40 seconds, I gained absolute untraceable control over the master audiovisual routing node for the entire corporate headquarters. I could see the live data packets flowing from the press conference cameras through the internal servers before broadcasting out to the global internet. Griffin was currently standing right in front of a massive 80-inch high-definition presentation screen that displayed his pristine corporate logo. He was answering questions from a prominent financial journalist, dramatically wiping a fake tear from his eye as he spoke about the painful burden of leadership. I synced the forensic files from my flash drive directly into the active broadcast queue. I did not just want to interrupt his speech. I wanted to publicly execute his credibility in real time using the exact same massive audience he had gathered to destroy mine. I adjusted the final output parameters, ensuring the incoming visual feed would override the primary cameras entirely. I took a slow, deep breath, watching his smug face on my laptop. I pressed the Enter key to initiate the final sequence. The massive high-definition screen directly behind Griffin abruptly flickered and went entirely black. A collective gasp echoed through the crowded lobby as the pristine corporate logo vanished. Griffin stopped speaking mid-sentence, looking around in sudden confusion. He tapped his microphone, assuming it was a simple hardware malfunction. It was not a malfunction. It was an execution. A bright, glaring, white terminal window suddenly expanded across the giant screen, illuminating Griffin in a harsh, unforgiving light. The live stream feed completely switched from his face to the digital evidence. I triggered the automated presentation. The screen boldly displayed the isolated audio waveform of the racial slurs. Then the visual stripped away the background noise, isolating the exact synthetic compression artifact. A massive red circle appeared around the mathematical loop, and bold text flashed across the screen explicitly identifying the digital fingerprint as a commercial artificial intelligence voice cloning software. The thousands of viewers watching online were suddenly looking at undeniable proof of a deepfake. But I was not finished. I advanced the sequence. The screen transitioned to the brute force decryption protocol. The audience watched in real time as the metadata tag unspooled, revealing the exact date and time the audio file was manufactured. Finally, the massive screen displayed the originating Internet Protocol address in giant, undeniable font. The numbers hung in the air for 3 agonizing seconds before the system automatically cross-referenced the registry. The name and residential address associated with the router appeared directly beneath the IP address. It was Griffin's personal downtown luxury penthouse. The lobby erupted into absolute chaos. Journalists started shouting, shoving their microphones toward the podium, demanding to know if the CEO had just been caught fabricating a racist audio file to frame his own engineer. Griffin turned around and stared at the massive screen displaying his home address and his ultimate guilt. The blood drained entirely from his face. His carefully constructed facade shattered into a million pieces. He was caught in a digital trap he could not possibly talk his way out of, exposed in front of the entire world. The crisis management team finally snapped out of their paralyzed shock. Someone scrambled to the audiovisual control desk and violently pulled the primary power cord from the wall. The massive screen died instantly, and the live stream broadcast abruptly cut to a static error message. But the damage was already catastrophic and entirely irreversible. Thousands of people had already taken screenshots and recorded the live feed. The undeniable forensic evidence was permanently etched into the public domain. Griffin stood frozen behind the sleek glass podium, his mouth hanging open in sheer terror. The journalists were no longer asking sympathetic questions. They were aggressively demanding answers about digital fraud and corporate slander. Through the chaotic audio feed still transmitting from a secondary microphone, I heard the heavy rhythmic wail of approaching sirens echoing down the city street. The local police department had been watching the live broadcast just like everyone else. Generating a fraudulent deepfake to incite public panic and falsely accuse a citizen of a crime was a severe digital felony. Through the frantic camera movements of a news crew still recording on their phones, I saw 3 uniformed police officers push their way through the crowded lobby. They walked directly up to the podium and sternly ordered Griffin to place his hands behind his back. The adjustment was almost complete. I watched the local news channel broadcast the footage of Griffin being shoved into the back of a police cruiser. The corporate empire was officially dead, but my war was only half over. I closed my laptop and picked up my phone to call Hayes. It was time to reclaim the sanctuary my wife and I had built together. While her former lover was being fingerprinted at the precinct, Megan was completely oblivious to the shifting tides. She had fully embraced her new status as a wealthy, independent socialite who had successfully stolen a multi-million-dollar property. According to a tip from a sympathetic neighbor who had known Cynthia and me for decades, Megan was currently hosting a lavish catered cocktail party at my house. She was actively celebrating her freshly filed divorce and her newly acquired real estate portfolio. She had hired a string quartet, a private chef and valet parking for her elite guests, all paid for by the very same bank accounts that were currently frozen or flagged for federal review. She thought she was untouchable. She believed she had outsmarted both her husband and her father-in-law. She was celebrating her absolute victory on the very hardwood floors my wife had polished by hand. I put on my corduroy jacket and walked out to my car. Hayes was already waiting for me at the courthouse. We had one final legal maneuver to execute. Hayes had not wasted a single second while the media was entirely focused on Griffin's spectacular downfall. Using the recorded confession I obtained from Cameron Hayes, filed an emergency ex parte motion with a federal property judge. The motion outlined the massive coordinated real estate fraud Megan and Cameron had executed to steal my home. Because the evidence was absolutely indisputable, the judge signed an immediate order of reversal and eviction without requiring a lengthy civil trial. I met Hayes in the courthouse parking lot. He handed me a certified copy of the judge's order bearing the heavy blue ink of the state seal. We drove to my suburban neighborhood, followed closely by 2 marked sheriff's patrol vehicles. The quiet, tree-lined street was completely choked with expensive imported luxury cars. Valets in crisp white shirts were frantically trying to manage the overflow parking. I stepped out of my old sedan and walked up the familiar concrete driveway. The front door was wide open, spilling warm yellow light and the soft sounds of classical music out into the cool evening air. I walked right past the hired security guard, followed closely by Hayes and the 2 armed deputies. The living room was packed with wealthy local socialites holding crystal champagne flutes. They were admiring the intricate crown molding and the expensive artwork Megan had hastily purchased to replace Cynthia's family photographs. Megan was standing near the grand fireplace, wearing a stunning red designer gown, laughing loudly at a joke someone had just made. She looked up and saw me standing in the entryway, flanked by law enforcement. Her arrogant laugh died instantly in her throat. She gripped her champagne glass so tightly I thought the delicate crystal would shatter in her hand. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The room descended into a heavy, uncomfortable silence as dozens of wealthy guests turned to stare at the old man in the faded jacket. Megan marched toward me, her face flushed with sudden hot anger. She demanded to know how I had gotten past security and ordered the deputies to arrest me for trespassing. She loudly proclaimed to her wealthy audience that I was a deranged, estranged relative who had been legally evicted. Hayes stepped forward, completely blocking her path. Hayes did not raise his voice. He spoke with the cold, measured authority of a man who held the absolute power of the court in his hands. He addressed Megan loudly enough for every single guest in the sprawling living room to hear. He informed her that she was no longer the legal owner of this property. He handed her the heavy legal folder containing the judge's emergency order. Megan snatched it from his hands, her eyes scanning the bold text. She sneered and called it a fake document, insisting she had an ironclad notarized deed transfer proving I had willingly surrendered the house to secure a corporate loan. Hayes smiled his terrifying razor-thin smile. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a secondary stack of highly detailed technical documents. He told Megan that a notary stamp was only valid if the signatory was physically present in the room. Hayes then presented a massive packet of digital cellular triangulation data and secure hotel receipts. He announced to the silent room that on the exact date and time my signature was supposedly notarized on the deed transfer, I was physically attending an engineering summit in Chicago, over 700 miles away. The GPS records from my phone, the flight logs, and the hotel surveillance cameras proved my location with absolute mathematical certainty. I could not possibly have been sitting in a local bank branch, signing away my wife's legacy. Hayes did not stop there. He delivered the final devastating blow. He informed Megan that armed federal investigators had visited the corrupt notary public at her home 2 hours ago. Faced with the overwhelming GPS evidence and the threat of severe prison time for federal bank fraud, the notary completely broke down. She confessed on tape that Megan had paid her a cash bribe of $10,000 to illegally stamp the forged signature Cameron had provided. The guests gasped in collective shock. The wealthy socialites who had just been drinking her champagne were now looking at her with absolute disgust. Megan's face turned completely chalk white. The physical evidence of her crime was entirely undeniable. She had built her new luxurious life on a foundation of easily disprovable lies, completely forgetting that she was dealing with an engineer who tracked every single piece of data in his life. The senior sheriff's deputy stepped forward, resting his hand casually on his utility belt. He looked directly at Megan and informed her that the federal judge had officially voided the fraudulent deed. The house legally belonged to me once again. The deputy ordered Megan to vacate the premises immediately. He explicitly told her she was not allowed to pack any bags or take any personal property, as the house was now an active crime scene pending a complete inventory check by federal fraud investigators. Megan was completely trapped. She had absolutely no legal recourse and no allies left in the world. The wealthy guests began rapidly filing out the front door, eager to distance themselves from a woman about to be indicted for major felonies. Megan looked around her stolen castle as it rapidly emptied. She turned back to me, her eyes burning with a manic, unrestrained hatred. She walked past me toward the open front door, her red gown dragging heavily against the hardwood floor. As she crossed the threshold, she stopped and leaned in close to my face. She hissed that I had not won everything. She swore she knew exactly where I kept my most prized possession, and she promised to completely destroy it before the night was over. She marched out into the darkness, leaving me standing victorious in my own home. I stood alone in the grand entryway of my home. The silence that settled over the house was profound, a stark contrast to the loud, arrogant classical music that had been playing just minutes before. I locked the heavy oak door and leaned my back against the sturdy wood, closing my eyes and taking a deep breath. The scent of spilled champagne and expensive designer perfume lingered heavily in the air, a foul reminder of the intruders. But beneath that superficial stench, I could still catch the faint familiar smell of the lavender polish Cynthia always used on the grand staircase banister. It was going to take a massive cleaning crew and several days to scrub away the physical traces of Megan's toxic presence, but the crushing emotional weight was finally gone. I walked slowly through the quiet living room, stepping over discarded cocktail napkins. I turned off the bright overhead chandeliers until only the soft, warm glow of a single corner lamp remained. My chest felt incredibly lighter than it had in days. My heart was beating with a steady, strong rhythm, finally free from the constant threat of stress-induced failure. I walked into the kitchen, opened the polished refrigerator, and poured myself a simple glass of cold tap water. Just as I lifted the cool glass to my lips, the sharp ring of my cell phone shattered the quiet night. I set the glass down onto the granite counter and pulled the device from my jacket pocket. The caller identification displayed a secure, encrypted federal number originating from Washington. I pressed the green button and raised the phone to my ear. It was Director Harper, the stern lead federal investor who had walked out of the boardroom and voided the grant. Her tone was sharp, strictly professional, and completely devoid of pleasantries. Director Harper did not waste my time asking how my evening was going or offering empty corporate apologies for doubting my integrity. She operated on pure, ruthless efficiency, and I respected her immensely for it. She stated flatly that she and the other 17 members of the elite Federal Investment Board had just finished watching the spectacular public meltdown of my former chief executive officer. They had seen the undeniable forensic evidence I projected onto the massive lobby screen exposing his deepfake forgery to the entire world. More importantly, they had already received the preliminary police reports confirming Griffin's arrest for severe digital fraud and public endangerment. Harper admitted with a sigh of frustration that the board had made a critical, almost fatal miscalculation. They had foolishly trusted the polished corporate facade and slick vocabulary of a young, charismatic businessman instead of trusting the quiet, seasoned engineer who had actually spent 15 years building the complex system. She told me the Department of Energy had spent the last 8 hours conducting a massive rapid audit of the classified military patents and the underlying server architecture I had locked down. The results were absolutely definitive and mathematically undeniable. The federal audit proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was the sole architectural genius behind the entire green energy grid. Griffin had contributed absolutely nothing of technical value. He had merely provided a sleek office building and a hollow marketing campaign funded by stolen money. Harper paused for a fraction of a second, letting the immense weight of her words settle between us in the quiet kitchen. Then she made her strategic move. She informed me that the $3.6 billion federal grant was officially back on the table. The government desperately needed the energy grid to go live before the end of the current fiscal year, and they knew I was the only human being on the planet legally authorized and intellectually capable of securely decrypting the master servers and finalizing the national deployment. They wanted me back in charge. But the federal government does not simply hand billions of dollars to an independent contractor working out of his suburban living room. Harper explained that the grant required a massive, heavily regulated corporate infrastructure to legally process the federal funds and manage the physical deployment of the technology. They needed a fully functioning, compliant corporation, and I currently did not possess one. Director Harper laid out the strict, non-negotiable conditions of their offer with cold precision. They were entirely willing to place me in absolute, unquestioned control of the entire project, officially naming me the primary federal liaison and the chief executive officer of the new venture. However, they demanded that I immediately acquire the massive physical hardware infrastructure that Griffin had left behind in his ruined skyscraper. When Griffin foolishly attempted to sell his company's remaining shell assets to an anonymous foreign buyer during his blind panic, he inadvertently triggered a massive federal trade block. The Department of Defense had instantly frozen the international sale because the server racks contained classified military data pathways that could never leave domestic soil. As a direct result of his treasonous blunder, Griffin's former corporation was now entirely bankrupt, completely paralyzed by federal injunctions, and bleeding millions of dollars every single day in massive legal penalties. Harper told me the government could not legally seize the physical servers without engaging in a grueling decade-long constitutional lawsuit over private property rights. The only viable immediate path forward was a hostile corporate takeover from the inside. She offered me a heavily secured federal loan completely separate from the primary grant specifically designated for corporate acquisition. Her demand was simple but brutally effective. I had to use the federal backing to quietly buy up all of Griffin's outstanding corporate debt for absolute pennies on the dollar. Because Griffin was sitting in a concrete jail cell and his elite legal team had completely abandoned him, his creditors were terrified. They were desperate to unload the toxic debt to absolutely anyone willing to take it before the company went into full liquidation. By purchasing the vast majority of the debt, I would legally become the primary lien holder and majority shareholder of the entire corporation. I would not just be replacing Griffin as a boss. I would be physically and legally absorbing his entire bankrupt empire into my own portfolio. Harper told me it was the only way to secure the physical servers, protect the classified patents, and satisfy the strict infrastructural requirements of the $3.6 billion grant. I listened to the low hum of my refrigerator as I processed the massive scale of her demand. I was a combat veteran and an engineer, not a ruthless corporate raider. but I had spent the last 3 days learning exactly how vicious the corporate world could be. I had absolutely no intention of leaving my life's work rotting in a locked server room. I took a slow sip of my cold water, letting the chill ground my thoughts. I looked out the dark windows of my living room, thinking about the sheer arrogance of the men who had tried to discard me like obsolete machinery. I spoke directly into the phone and told Director Harper I accepted her terms without a single condition. She instructed me to have my legal counsel contact the Federal Treasury Department at exactly dawn to facilitate the massive transfer of acquisition funds. She ended the call with a sharp, decisive click. I did not wait for the morning. I immediately dialed Jonathan Hayes. I did not care that it was approaching 2 in the morning. When Hayes answered, his voice was sharp, alert, and ready for war. I relayed Harper's precise instructions regarding the federal loan and the debt acquisition strategy. Hayes let out a low, deeply impressed whistle. He told me he would begin aggressively buying up Griffin's toxic debt from the terrified institutional creditors before the stock market even opened. By sunrise, the legal paperwork would be completely finalized and filed with the state. I hung up the phone and walked to the window, watching the pale moonlight filter through the old oak trees in my front yard. I had started this week standing in the freezing rain, locked out of my own life, holding nothing but a battered briefcase and a broken heart. Tomorrow morning I would walk back into that towering glass skyscraper, not as a terminated employee, but as the absolute legal owner of the entire corporation. The final execution was at hand. I left my newly reclaimed home just before dawn to meet Jonathan Hayes at his office. We spent 2 hours signing the massive stacks of expedited financial paperwork required to officially execute the hostile buyout of Griffin's corporate debt. By the time I returned to my quiet suburban street, the sun was just beginning to break over the horizon, casting a pale morning light across my front lawn. I walked up the driveway, feeling the deep exhaustion finally settling into my bones. I unlocked the heavy oak front door and stepped inside. A cold draft immediately hit my face. The house was completely silent, but the ambient temperature had dropped significantly. I walked quickly toward the back of the house, my combat instincts flaring. The heavy glass pane of the kitchen patio door was entirely shattered. Shards of safety glass littered the polished hardwood floor. I did not call out. I moved silently up the grand staircase directly to the master bedroom. Megan had promised to destroy my most prized possession as she was being evicted by the sheriff. I walked to the far corner of my bedroom and dropped to my knees. The thick Persian rug had been violently thrown aside. The loose floorboard I had carefully installed decades ago was pried open and splintered. I looked down into the dark cavity. The small hand-carved mahogany lockbox was gone. Inside that box was Cynthia's diamond wedding ring, the exact ring I had placed on her finger 40 years ago. My cell phone buzzed sharply in my jacket pocket. I pulled it out and stared at the bright screen. It was a text message from an unknown burner number. I opened the message and a high-resolution photograph slowly loaded. My stomach turned completely cold. The image showed Cynthia's delicate gold and diamond wedding ring dangling dangerously from a thin piece of sewing thread. Directly beneath the ring was the dark, rusted metal maw of an industrial kitchen garbage disposal. I could clearly see the razor-sharp grinding blades waiting in the dark drain. A second message immediately followed the picture. Megan's text was dripping with venom and desperate arrogance. She informed me that the garbage disposal was currently running at maximum capacity. She stated that she had nothing left to lose and was perfectly willing to reduce my dead wife's sacred memory to metallic dust in a matter of seconds. She issued her final, non-negotiable demand. She knew the medical trust account still held several $100,000, and she assumed my new federal partnership provided me with limitless capital. She demanded I wire exactly $1 million into a heavily encrypted, untraceable offshore account in the Cayman Islands. She gave me a strict deadline of noon to execute the transfer. Once the money cleared the international banking protocols, she promised to leave the ring in a designated public locker. If I called the police or missed the deadline by a single minute, she would drop the thread. She demanded I meet her in person at an abandoned multi-level concrete parking garage on the desolate edge of the industrial district to physically hand over the wire transfer confirmation receipt. She truly believed she had finally discovered my ultimate breaking point. She thought the threat of losing Cynthia's physical legacy would paralyze my logical mind and force me to surrender. She was operating on pure desperate emotion. I did not panic. I did not reply to her text message begging for mercy. I immediately went to my computer and began compiling a very different kind of document. I arrived at the desolate concrete parking garage precisely at noon. The massive structure was entirely abandoned, slated for demolition by the city next month. The wind howled through the empty concrete pillars, kicking up dust and old debris. I walked slowly up the cracked access ramp to the third level. Megan was waiting near the edge of the open structure. She was no longer wearing the stunning red designer gown from her lavish party. She wore dark, unassuming clothes, her blonde hair pulled back in a messy knot. She looked incredibly exhausted, paranoid, and completely unhinged. In her left hand, she gripped the carved mahogany lockbox. In her right hand, she held Cynthia's wedding ring between her thumb and index finger, suspending it casually over the sheer concrete drop to the street below. She demanded the bank receipt immediately, her voice echoing loudly against the cold concrete walls. I walked toward her, my footsteps steady and deliberate. I did not bring a bank receipt. I did not bring a single penny. I stopped 10 feet away from her and pulled a thick, heavy manila folder from inside my corduroy jacket. I tossed the folder onto the dusty concrete floor between us. It landed with a loud, authoritative slap. Megan stared at it suspiciously, demanding to know what it was. I told her to look at her $1 million payout. She cautiously stepped forward, keeping the ring suspended over the ledge, and picked up the folder. She opened the cover and began reading the top page. Her eyes widened in absolute horror. When I had used my federal authority to freeze her accounts at the bank yesterday, I gained temporary administrative access to her complete financial history. I spent the morning running a forensic algorithmic trace on her routing numbers. The folder contained 5 years of irrefutable audited proof of massive tax evasion. She had been secretly funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars of corporate funds into private luxury accounts without reporting a single cent to the federal government. I told her the penalty for aggravated federal tax fraud was severe, and the government did not negotiate with thieves. Megan screamed a vicious curse and pulled her arm back, preparing to throw the diamond ring directly off the concrete ledge into the busy traffic below. Before she could complete the physical motion, the entire third floor of the parking garage was suddenly illuminated by blinding high-intensity halogen headlights. 2 unmarked black tactical vehicles had driven silently up the opposing ramp and were now completely blocking the only exit. The heavy doors swung open, and 6 armed agents wearing dark tactical vests stepped out into the harsh light. The bold yellow letters on their ballistic vests read, IRS Criminal Investigation. Megan froze in absolute terror. The sheer shock of the ambush shattered her remaining nerves. Her fingers went completely limp. The diamond ring slipped from her grasp and fell toward the concrete floor. I lunged forward with the speed of a man half my age and caught the gold band securely in my right hand before it could bounce over the edge. I stood up, clutching my wife's legacy tightly against my chest. The federal agents swarmed Megan, shouting strict commands. They grabbed her arms, forcing them violently behind her back. The heavy metal handcuffs clicked shut with a harsh, definitive snap. She did not fight them. She collapsed into a pathetic, weeping mess as they read her Miranda rights. 2 agents grabbed her by the shoulders and shoved her roughly into the back of the dark federal transport vehicle. The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing her fate completely. I placed the ring safely into my pocket and walked away. Griffin had managed to secure a massive emergency bail bond using the last of his hidden offshore funds. He did not go home to his luxury penthouse, which was currently crawling with police forensic teams searching for digital evidence. He went directly to the only place he thought he still had a shred of control. He broke the police tape on the front doors of his own corporate headquarters and took the private executive elevator up to the 50th floor. The sprawling glass boardroom was completely empty and dead silent. The power had been severely restricted by the utility companies due to unpaid bills, leaving the massive room bathed in the gray, depressing light of the early morning. Griffin was a man entirely stripped of his former glory. He wore the same wrinkled Italian suit from the day of the federal raid. His hair was greasy and unkempt. He stood next to a heavy-duty industrial paper shredder, desperately feeding thick stacks of confidential financial ledgers and offshore wire transfer receipts into the grinding metal teeth. He believed that if he could destroy the final physical copies of his corporate embezzlement, he might be able to negotiate a plea deal that avoided maximum security prison. He was sweating profusely, his hands trembling violently as the machine chewed through the evidence of his massive arrogance. He was so consumed by his frantic destruction that he completely failed to hear the elevator chime in the main lobby. The heavy mahogany double doors of the boardroom suddenly swung inward, hitting the glass walls with a loud, resounding crash. Griffin jumped in sheer panic, dropping a thick stack of papers onto the floor. He spun around, his eyes wide with paranoid terror, fully expecting to see a swarm of federal agents returning to finish the job. Instead, I walked slowly into the room. I was wearing my best tailored dark suit, completely replacing the faded corduroy jacket he had so viciously mocked just a few days prior. My posture was perfectly straight, and my heart beat with the steady, calm rhythm of absolute victory. I did not come alone. Jonathan Hayes walked directly to my right, carrying a sleek black leather briefcase and exuding the cold, predatory aura of an executioner. To my left walked Director Harper, flanked by two highly decorated military officers representing the Department of Defense. The sheer power standing in the doorway was overwhelming. We stepped into the room in absolute silence. Griffin stared at us, his jaw clenching in a pathetic mixture of rage and fear. He tried to summon his old corporate bravado, puffing out his chest and demanding to know how we had bypassed the lobby security. He falsely claimed that the building was still his private property and ordered us to leave before he called the police. His threat was incredibly hollow, a desperate echo of a dead empire. He was standing in the dark, surrounded by shredded paper, trying to command the very people who held his absolute fate in their hands. Director Harper looked at Griffin with pure disgust. She did not even acknowledge his pathetic demand. She simply stepped aside, allowing me to take the physical lead. I walked over to the massive mahogany conference table. It was the exact same table where he had publicly humiliated me and stripped me of my security badge. I ran my hand slowly across the polished wood, feeling the cold surface. I looked across the table at the broken young man who had tried to steal my life's work. I told him he was wasting his time shredding those documents because the federal auditors already had full digital copies of every single illegal transaction he had ever made. Griffin scoffed desperately, trying to mask his rising panic with a vicious sneer. He loudly declared that even with a looming federal trial, he was still the primary registered stakeholder of the corporate shell. He claimed that the physical servers, the building lease, and the massive hardware infrastructure legally belonged to him until a federal bankruptcy judge explicitly said otherwise. He truly thought he still possessed a tiny sliver of leverage to negotiate a lucrative buyout. Jonathan Hayes stepped forward, completely destroying that final illusion. Hayes placed his black leather briefcase squarely on the mahogany table and snapped the brass latches open. The sound echoed sharply in the quiet room. He pulled out a massive stack of freshly stamped legal documents secured in a heavy binder. He dropped the binder directly onto the table. It landed with a heavy, authoritative thud. Hayes looked at Griffin with his terrifying, razor-thin smile. He informed Griffin that while he was sitting in a holding cell desperately trying to secure bail, the financial markets had reacted to his arrest with absolute panic. Every single institutional creditor holding debt for this company had rushed to liquidate their exposure. Hayes stated that at exactly 6 o'clock this morning, acting under my direct instructions and utilizing a secured federal line of credit, he had aggressively purchased every single ounce of the corporation's toxic debt. Because the creditors believed the company was completely worthless, Hayes had bought the debt for absolute pennies on the dollar. Griffin's eyes darted frantically down to the heavy binder on the table. He could clearly see the official seals of the State Commerce Department and the Federal Treasury. Hayes did not stop there. He delivered the final legal blow with absolute precision. He explained that by holding the vast majority of the corporate debt, I had legally executed an immediate hostile takeover. The corporate charter explicitly stated that in the event of total insolvency, the primary lien holder automatically absorbs all remaining physical and intellectual assets. Hayes pointed a rigid finger directly at Griffin's chest. He told him that he did not own this building, he did not own the servers, and he did not own the chairs in this room. The corporation now belonged entirely to me. I was the absolute majority shareholder, the sole owner, and the new chief executive officer. Griffin stared at the legal documents in absolute paralyzing shock. The industrial shredder continued to hum quietly in the background, a pathetic soundtrack to his total defeat. His entire empire, built on arrogance and stolen capital, had been legally ripped from his hands in a matter of hours. He slowly raised his head and looked at me. There was no anger left in his eyes, only the hollow, vacant stare of a man who finally realized he had been completely outmatched. I stood at the head of the mahogany table, assuming the exact physical position he had occupied on the day he tried to end my career. The symmetry of the moment was absolute. I looked him directly in the eye, feeling the immense weight of the journey I had endured to reach this exact second. I did not raise my voice, and I did not gloat. I simply delivered the final adjustment with cold, mechanical precision. I repeated the exact words he had spoken to me. I told him he was done here. I told him to hand over his badge. Griffin slowly reached a trembling hand to his lapel. He unclipped his plastic security badge and dropped it onto the table. He turned around and walked out of the boardroom in absolute silence, leaving his broken empire behind. Griffin did not say a single word as he turned away from the mahogany table. He walked toward the heavy glass doors with the slow, unsteady gait of a man walking to the gallows. Two large corporate security guards, the exact same men Griffin had gleefully ordered to throw me out of the building just a few days ago, stepped out of the hallway shadows. They flanked him immediately, their faces entirely devoid of sympathy. They did not gently guide him. They grabbed him firmly by the arms and marched him toward the executive elevator. I stood at the head of the boardroom table and watched the polished metal doors slide shut, perfectly sealing his fate. I took the secondary elevator down to the ground floor a few minutes later, arriving just in time to witness the final consequence of his arrogance. The security guard shoved Griffin through the revolving glass doors of the grand lobby and out onto the concrete plaza. He stumbled into the bright morning sunlight, blinking rapidly. He did not find freedom waiting for him. 3 heavily armed United States Marshals were standing directly in front of his waiting town car. When Griffin had panicked and attempted to illegally sell the classified federal servers to a foreign shell corporation, he had explicitly violated the strict conditions of his emergency bail bond. The marshals did not bother reading him his rights again. They tackled him roughly against the hood of the car, securing his wrists with heavy steel chains. His corporate execution was entirely complete. I watched the marshals load Griffin into their armored transport vehicle before I turned my attention back to the massive, bustling corporate lobby. Employees were whispering quietly in small groups, terrified about the sudden shift in power and the presence of federal agents. I began walking toward the main security desk to officially register my administrative credentials. As I crossed the polished marble floor, a hunched figure stepped out from behind a large marble pillar directly blocking my path. I stopped and looked at the man. It took me a full 5 seconds to recognize my own flesh and blood. Cameron stood before me, but the arrogant vice president in the bespoke Italian suit was entirely gone. He was wearing a cheap, ill-fitting gray polyester uniform with a local commercial cleaning service logo stitched over the breast pocket. He held a plastic bucket in one trembling hand. Because his bank accounts were entirely frozen, and his aggressive bail bondsman demanded immediate weekly payments to keep him out of jail pending his federal espionage trial. My son had been forced to take the lowest-paying night-shift janitorial job he could find. He looked absolutely exhausted, his eyes sunken and surrounded by dark, bruised circles. His hands were raw and blistered from harsh chemical cleaners. He dropped the plastic bucket onto the marble floor. It hit with a loud, hollow clatter. Cameron fell to his knees right in the middle of the crowded lobby. He grabbed the fabric of my tailored trousers and began to weep hysterically. The tears streamed down his pale face, dripping onto my polished leather shoes. He begged me for a second chance. He cried out that he had done exactly what I asked, reminding me that he had worn the wire to the penthouse and successfully captured Griffin's confession. He frantically apologized for forging my signature on the foreclosure documents, for abandoning me at the deposition, and for letting Megan disrespect his mother's memory. He pleaded with me to use my new immense power and federal connections to drop the remaining criminal charges against him. He begged me to give him his old executive job back, promising he would be the perfect, obedient son for the rest of his life. He was a broken, terrified boy, desperately trying to crawl back into the safety of his father's shadow. I looked down at the weeping man clutching my legs. I did not feel the fiery heat of anger or the cold satisfaction of revenge. I only felt a deep, profound sorrow settling heavily into my chest. I remembered teaching him how to ride a bicycle in the driveway of the home he had just tried to steal from me. I remembered the fierce protective pride I felt on the day he graduated from college. I loved my son deeply, and seeing him reduced to a trembling mess on a public lobby floor was a specialized kind of agony. But the immense love of a father cannot blindly erase the catastrophic actions of a grown man. I reached down and firmly grabbed his wrists. I pried his shaking fingers off my trousers and forced him to stand up on his own 2 feet. I looked directly into his bloodshot eyes. My boundaries were no longer flexible. They were forged from solid steel. I spoke to him with a voice that was perfectly calm, entirely steady, and completely devoid of hatred. I told him that I genuinely forgave him. I explained that holding on to toxic resentment and bitter anger would only destroy my own failing heart, and I refused to let his terrible choices kill me. I forgave him for the forgery, the lies, and the profound disrespect. But then I delivered the hardest truth a parent can ever speak. I told Cameron that forgiveness does not equal restoration. Forgiving a person for stabbing you in the back does not mean you hand them another knife. It does not mean you invite them back into your home, and it absolutely does not mean you trust them with your life or your business ever again. He had fundamentally shattered the sacred bond of trust between a father and a son choosing money and corporate power over his own flesh and blood. I told him that wearing a wire to save his own skin from a federal prison sentence did not miraculously erase the devastating damage he had eagerly inflicted upon my life. He was asking for an absolute lack of consequences, and life simply does not work that way. The universe demands accountability, and I was no longer willing to shield him from the storm he had deliberately summoned. Cameron stared at me in absolute devastating silence. The frantic, hopeful light completely died in his eyes as the finality of my words crashed over him. He finally understood that there was no secret backdoor, no hidden financial bailout, and no magical paternal rescue waiting to save him from his own overwhelming greed. I let go of his wrists and stepped back, creating a permanent physical distance between us. I told him I sincerely hoped he would use the coming difficult years to truly rebuild his character from the ground up, but he would have to do it entirely on his own. I turned my back on my only child and walked away toward the primary security desk. I did not turn around when he started sobbing again. I did not hesitate when the heavy marble pillars finally blocked his pathetic figure from my sight. The toxic ties that had nearly dragged me into an early grave were permanently and completely severed. I took a deep, clean breath of the cool corporate air conditioning, feeling the immense weight of the last few days finally lift off my shoulders. The past was definitively dead. I walked past the line of terrified executives waiting to meet their new owner. I had survived the storm, and I had an entire empire to rebuild. Later that afternoon, I sat in the restored quiet of the executive boardroom. The massive mahogany table was entirely cleared of the shredded paper and the pathetic remnants of Griffin's reign. Director Harper sat across from me, sliding a pristine, heavy parchment document across the polished wood. It was the finalized $3.6 billion federal energy grant. I took out my silver fountain pen, the same pen I had used to hire Jonathan Hayes, and signed my name on the bottom line. But the financial structure of the grant had been completely rewritten under my strict direction. The billions of dollars would not flow into a bloated corporate operating account designed to enrich wealthy executives or greedy shareholders. I had legally established a highly secure, heavily audited nonprofit trust to manage the entire capital influx. The project was returning to its original pure intention. The green energy grid would be built, but the resulting infrastructure and subsidized power would be directed entirely toward low-income neighborhoods across the country, providing sustainable relief to communities that had been ignored for decades. Director Harper watched me cap the silver pen. She offered a rare, genuine smile, stood up, and extended her hand. I shook it firmly. The federal government had its mastermind back, and I had successfully secured my life's work against any future corporate parasites. The massive bureaucratic machine finally roared to life, but this time my hands were firmly on the steering wheel. I drove away from the towering glass skyscraper as the late afternoon sun began to dip below the city skyline. The evening commute was heavy, but the traffic did not bother me. I navigated the familiar route back to my suburban neighborhood, pulling into the driveway of the colonial home that was finally and permanently mine again. The broken glass from the kitchen patio door had already been swept up and temporarily boarded over by a repair crew I hired earlier in the day. I walked through the front door and locked the heavy deadbolt behind me. The house was completely silent. It was not the heavy, suffocating silence of loneliness, nor the tense, hostile quiet of an impending attack. It was a profound, restorative peace. I walked slowly up the grand staircase, my hand trailing along the polished wooden banister. I entered the master bedroom and knelt beside the damaged floorboard. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out Cynthia's diamond wedding ring. The gold band caught the fading sunlight streaming through the window, gleaming just as brightly as it had 40 years ago. I carefully placed the ring back inside the hand-carved mahogany lockbox. I set the box gently into the hidden cavity and replaced the floorboard, securing it tightly. The physical anchor of my wife's legacy was safe. I stood up and looked around the room. The extravagant, superficial changes Megan had tried to force upon the space were already being dismantled. Tomorrow, I would bring Cynthia's framed photographs back from the storage unit and place them precisely where they belonged on the mantel. I walked downstairs to the kitchen and made myself a simple cup of black tea. I sat at the oak dining table, the exact same spot where Griffin and Cameron had arrogantly tried to discard me just a week ago. The contrast between that moment of utter disrespect and this current reality was staggering. They had brought a massive storm of chaos into my quiet sanctuary. But the storm had finally broken against the solid rock of my resolve. I took a slow sip of the hot tea, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. The house was breathing again, and so was I. As I sat in the quiet dining room, I reflected on the sheer velocity of the last few days. A younger, more foolish version of myself might have reacted to the initial public firing with explosive anger. I could have flipped the boardroom table, shouted at the federal investors, or engaged in a pathetic shouting match with Griffin and Cameron, but reacting to disrespect with raw emotion is exactly what parasitic people expect and desire. It feeds their massive ego and validates their false sense of authority. I realized with absolute clarity that true undeniable power does not come from screaming the loudest or throwing the hardest physical punch. True power is entirely silent. It is meticulously forged in the quiet, unseen hours of relentless preparation. It is the encrypted hard drive securely hidden in the lining of a battered briefcase. It is the classified military patent kept neatly folded in a breast pocket. It is the absolute unyielding enforcement of personal boundaries. When my enemies tried to take my dignity, I did not argue with them to get it back. I simply removed the structural foundations of their entire existence. I let their own massive arrogance and insatiable greed act as the primary catalysts for their spectacular destruction. Griffin was currently sitting in a federal holding cell facing decades of incarceration because he could not resist bragging on a hidden microphone. Megan was being processed by the Internal Revenue Service because she was too blinded by her stolen wealth to cover her financial tracks. Cameron was scrubbing floors in a cheap uniform because he chose the illusion of corporate status over the solid reality of familial loyalty. They had all completely destroyed themselves. I simply provided the architectural framework for their consequences to properly manifest. Society often mistakes kindness and silence in older people for weakness or cognitive decline. They assume that because our hair is gray and our physical steps are slower, our minds have entirely lost their sharp edge. My enemies made that exact fatal miscalculation. They failed to understand that decades of strict discipline, structural engineering, and raw life experience forge a level of tactical competence that pure arrogance can never defeat. The sun finally set, completely casting long, deep shadows across the hardwood floor of the living room. I stood up from the oak dining table and carried my empty teacup to the kitchen sink. I felt a profound surge of intellectual energy, a sharp contrast to the physical exhaustion of the morning. I walked into my private home office, the room Megan had callously ransacked, and sat down at my heavy wooden desk. I opened my laptop. The machine booted up instantly, the screen casting a cool, bright glow into the dark room. I did not open the files for the federal energy grid. That architecture was already complete and securely in the hands of the government. I opened a completely blank terminal window. A flashing green cursor waited patiently for my command. I rested my hands lightly on the keyboard, staring at the infinite possibilities of the empty screen. I began writing the initial sequence of code for a brand new, highly advanced engineering project. It was something entirely my own, something that would define the next decade of my life. The rhythmic clicking of the keys filled the quiet house, a steady heartbeat of progress and pure creation. The toxic elements had been permanently purged. The quiet order of my life was fully restored. The adjustment was complete. I learned a final, undeniable truth about the modern illusion of power and the fallacy of obsolescence. My enemies fundamentally believed that power is something you can simply take by force manipulation or a forged signature on a legal deed. They belonged to a shallow culture that worships the aesthetic of success over the grueling, unglamorous reality of actually building it. Griffin paraded around in bespoke suits and rented penthouses, dangerously mistaking his corporate title for actual technical competence. Cameron traded his moral compass for a corner office, foolishly believing that stealing my life's work would magically grant him my intellect. They looked at my gray hair and my faded corduroy jacket and saw a disposable relic. They thought they could strip me of my physical possessions, lock me out of my own home, and leave me with absolutely nothing. But true wealth and true power are never external. You can steal a man's house, freeze his bank accounts, and publicly revoke his security badge, but you can never steal his mind. My decades of relentless discipline, profound technical mastery, and unyielding emotional control were the actual load-bearing pillars of the $3.6 billion empire. When they forced me out the door, they did not just lose a senior engineer. They completely amputated their own life support system. They learned the hard way that a pristine corporate title means absolutely nothing if you do not understand the deep mechanics of the complex machine you are trying to drive. I walked away from this ordeal with a profound sense of internal security. I know now that my true value is completely independent of corporate approval or familial validation. I am a builder, and as long as I retain my intellect and my unwavering standards, I can always reconstruct a kingdom from the ashes. If you believe that deep competence and silent preparation will always outlast arrogant entitlement, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own experiences in the comments below.